We are now broadcasting.
Wonderful. Well, I'm Ryan Price. I'm the chair of the Environmental Quality Commission in Menlo Park, and I would like to welcome everybody to the June 24th Environmental Quality Commission meeting. This is obviously a teleconference meeting with the Environmental Quality or EQC members, city staff, and members of the public participating remotely to ensure that we have proper social distancing in the federal, state, and local emergency. So I'll start by calling roll. So I'd like to introduce each of the members. We have Deb Martin. Do you want to wave maybe?
Sorry, hello, trying to take myself off mute. Thank you.
This is the practice round, it's great. We have Rebecca Turley.
Hi.
We have Josie Gellard.
Hi.
We have Janelle London.
Hi.
We have the Vice Chair, James Payne.
Hello.
And Tom Cabot.
Hello.
And obviously we have our sustainability manager, Rebecca Lucky, who we work very closely with. And she will be the staff member presenting and staff kind of presiding over the meeting as well. Rebecca, could you please provide instructions to the EQC members and members of the public on how we will run this meeting today?
Thank you, Chair Price and members of the Environmental Quality Commission. Welcome everyone to the June 24th Special Environmental Quality Commission meeting, and thank you for attending. At this time, we ask the members of the EQC, the Environmental Quality Commission, to please remain on screen for the duration of the meeting. You will control your own webcams and microphones. Staff will engage webcams and microphones to make presentations and respond to members of the EQC. For the members of the public or the attendees who wish to provide public comment, after the chair calls for public comment on an item you wish to speak on, please engage the raised hand feature, or you can type that you'd like to speak in the chat box. I will then have the ability to unmute your microphone and you can provide your public comment to the EQC, or I can read it if you would like. This concludes the instructions, and I return the meeting to Chair Price.
Thank you, Ms. Lucky. So we're going to transition down to regular business. Because this is a special meeting, we do not have public comment ahead of agenda items. So under regular business, the EQC considers recommendations from city staff on policy matters or administrative actions that require EQC approval. The first item on the agenda is to approve the December 10th, 2019, as well as the February 19th, 2020 meetings minutes. Are there any clarifying questions from the EQC before we take any public comment on this agenda item? I don't see any raised hands, which is the indication of a question from a commission member. Ms. Lucky, do we have any public comment on this item?
Thank you, Chair Price. No, we do not have any public comment.
Thank you. So now this item is open for discussion by EQC members. Is there any discussion regarding the meeting minutes from December and February? I see heads shaking, but no hands. Ms. Lucky, can you, oh, sorry.
I was gonna move, do we sort of do our normal Robert's Rule of Order move in second?
If you'd like to put a motion forward, you are welcome to put a motion forward.
Yes, I move that we approve the December and February minutes.
Do I have a second? Janelle's raising her hand to indicate she seconds the motion. Thank you. Can we have a vote on the item? And you can vote by raising your hand in the screen.
Aye.
All those in favor? And I'm seeing everyone is unanimously in favor of approving the minutes. Thank you. Items.
Pardon, Chair Price. So just as if we can move forward to have, I can call out everyone's name, and I think we do need to hear a yes or a no.
Oh, okay.
And even for the motions on second as well.
Okay.
Sorry.
So clarification. That's okay. So clarification, we will be voting on the with your voice live, having to state your preference clearly as an affirmative or not for your vote under the motion. So do we want to redo, Ms. Lucky, would you suggest that we redo the vote on the meeting minutes, or should we move ahead?
So let's just do a roll call. And I have noted that Commissioner London had seconded the motion from Commissioner Gillard. So I'll go through Commissioner Gillard.
Aye.
Commissioner Cabot.
Aye.
Commissioner London.
Aye.
Commissioner Martin.
Aye.
Commissioner Payne.
You may be muted, Commissioner Payne.
Yes.
James, Commissioner Payne may have fallen off of the meeting, perhaps. I don't see him. Oh, there he is. Commissioner Payne, we were taking a verbal vote on the meeting minutes, so we had kind of paused at your name. So if you
Okay.
have a,
I
if you would
apologize
like,
for
that's
the
okay,
interruption. Yeah.
no
I
problem.
had to reset my router, which of course worked fine during our testing period. Anyway, I have no changes to make to the minutes as they are posted.
So you would you, how, the motion on the table is to approve the meeting minutes as they stand. Would you be in favor of that?
I am in favor.
Thank you.
And Commissioner Price.
I approve. I agree.
Commissioner Turley.
Aye.
Motion passes unanimously.
Excellent. So now we are moving on and we understand how to vote and second. So we are going to move on to item C2 on our agenda. This is the recommended subcommittee, so that caps the Climate Action Plan subcommittee's draft of the Climate Action Plan that we are, the question is, we're being asked to recommend this plan to City Council, and the attachment is part of the meeting minutes. So I believe Commissioners Gillard, Cabot, and Payne are going to present this item to us. So I will pass it off to them.
Great, thank you. So I'll be presenting on behalf of Tom and James. It was very much a joint effort. So first of all, we've been waiting for months to present this to you all, so it's great to finally do it. We were ready to do it before COVID hit, and then COVID changed everything. So we're excited to finally share our work with you. So I'd like to start with an 8-minute video, which some of you may have seen, but it aired on NBC in February of this year. And it's about the impacts of climate change in our area. Rebecca, if you would launch that.
you ready to go to the next slide? Can you see the presentation?
We can see the presentation, yeah.
Mm.
The Bay Area is at a tipping point. That warning comes from a new report outlining what rising sea level will do to our area. Our investigative unit obtained an advanced copy, and we found some of it could be considered revolutionary. The bottom line, sea level rise will be more dramatic and may happen sooner than many of us realize. NBC Bay Area Stephen Stock explains.
Some of the flooding models we're about to demonstrate to you of this rising threat may sound like they come from alarmist voices of doom, but in fact they come from scientists, state planners, and policymakers. This report, one of 3 we studied for this story, identifies 14 different communities around the bay in danger of permanent flooding in just a couple of decades. Even so, we found construction still going up in those future flood zones, and you, the taxpayer, most likely will have to pay to bail them out.
This is all West Oakland.
73-year-old Margaret Gordon, Miss Margaret as she likes to be called, an advocate for disadvantaged communities, showed us around her neighborhood of West Oakland.
And this would all be underwater.
Yes, all this will be up underwater.
According to new scientific models, this area could see water several inches deep across several of its neighborhoods, with oncoming sea level rise expected in just a few decades.
Do you worry about the people who live here?
Oh, yes, because I know that many of us are going to be displaced. We'll never come back.
According to state planning documents, including this one from 2018, scientists expect that since 2000, sea levels could rise at least 6 inches and as much as 12 inches by 2030, just 10 years from now. As this graph shows, scientists say the rate of sea level rise is growing exponentially, all because of recent increases in ice melt and warming of the oceans.
We are absolutely at a crisis point.
Zach Wasserman chairs the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, or BCDC, a state agency that led the research on this report called Adapting to Rising Tides, a report that shows more than a dozen communities in the Bay Area at risk, including 91,000 housing units.
It is a slow-moving emergency.
Using that same data, our team created maps showing what a 12-inch sea level rise with a typical 5-year storm would look like, what planners say we should prepare for by 2030. In San Mateo County, parts of US 101 go underwater. SFO runways are covered. While the airport already plans to build seawalls, SFO could be left surrounded by water.
When you have a certain amount of rising sea level, if you do not adapt, then you're going to be in trouble.
Larry Goldsband serves as BCDC's executive director.
You're going to have water coming in, and you're going to have housing stock that won't be able to recover, and you're going to have communities that won't be able to recover.
What does the public need to understand about this crisis?
That there is no longer any way to stop it happening. The city allows this. Some of this is industrial and residential, all packed up on top of each other.
But despite the warnings, our investigative team found that building in these areas continues, including 24 major recent or current developments worth more than $13 billion.
Are taxpayers going to be on the hook for some of these buildings and projects 30 years from now?
We're all going to pay some, because that's what the public does. We either pay through taxes, we pay through FEMA coming in after a disaster.
Why are those buildings still allowed?
The Bay Area documents, including this one from 2018, scientists expect that since 2000, sea levels could rise at least 6 inches and as much as 12 inches by 2030.
The Bay Area is at a tipping point. That warning comes from a new report outlining what rising sea level
emergency.
Using that same data, our team created maps showing what a 12-inch sea level rise with a typical 5-year storm would look like, what planners say we should prepare for by 2030. In San Mateo County, parts of US 101 go underwater. SFO runways are covered. While the airport already plans to build seawalls, SFO could be left surrounded by water.
When you have a certain amount of rising sea level, if you do not adapt, then you're going to be in trouble.
Larry Goldsband serves as BCDC's executive director.
You're going to have water coming in, and you're going to have housing stock that won't be able to recover, and you're going to have communities that won't be able to recover.
What does the public need to understand about this crisis?
That there is no longer any way to stop it happening.
The city allows this. Some of this is industrial and residential, all packed up on top of each other.
But despite the warnings, our investigative team found that building in these areas continues, including 24 major recent or current developments worth more than $13 billion. Are taxpayers going to be on the hook for some of these buildings and projects 30 years from now?
We're all going to pay some up because that's what the public does. We either pay through taxes, we pay through FEMA coming in after a disaster.
Why are those buildings still allowed to be built right now?
For those that are within our jurisdiction, we are requiring adaptation methods.
Across the Bay Area, projects have been allowed to proceed in problematic flood zones. In Mountain View, using the same computer models, there's Google's choice in East and North Bay Shore developments that both could be surrounded by water. You acknowledge this is real?
Oh, I do, yes, and our city does.
Mountain View's Mayor Margaret Abe-Koga says for a decade her city has been pushing back against some development and requiring that companies prepare for rising sea levels. Even so, she agrees that 4 recent developments approved there are now at risk. Are the taxpayers going to be on the hook if this all goes south and it's worse than we expect?
I think it's going to be a shared responsibility, but at the same time, we are requiring these corporations to contribute.
Further north in Menlo Park, the Facebook campus expansion project began in 2015. After that project was approved, Menlo Park began requiring all new construction near the bay to raise building foundations by at least 2 feet. Even so, mapping the data with a 12-inch sea level rise combined with a 5-year storm shows that the new Facebook West campus, along with the original campus, would become an island.
It's definitely coming, and what are we going to do to protect our city?
Menlo Park Mayor Cecilia Taylor was not in office when Facebook West was approved and admits it could be surrounded by water sooner than anyone ever expected when it was first proposed. You're aware this is a problem?
Yes. There definitely is a concern now.
Then there's San Francisco. In 2030, with a 5-year storm, there could be flooding around brand new condos along Mission Creek. By 2050, 75 Howard Street could be surrounded. And by 2100, the brand new Golden State Warriors Arena, Chase Center, could have water all around it, inundating neighboring buildings. You'll have to wear your galoshes to get to a game. How are building projects like the Chase Center allowed to go forward when we know they're going to be sitting in a floodplain?
There's a balance between working to adapt for what we know is going to happen in the future and living our lives today.
Right now, as we sit here, is there a comprehensive plan to deal with sea level rise?
No.
Regionally?
No.
Should there be?
Yes.
This doesn't even account for events like king tides, El Nino, and 100-year storms. Those could make all of this that much worse. A representative from the Golden State Warriors told us that when they built the Chase Center, they went above and beyond all state requirements for sea level rise. And a representative for Facebook said that while all its new buildings account for sea level rise, the company is also partnering with several South Bay cities to protect the entire area from rising sea levels. We also reached out to the planning department with San Francisco, as well as to Google, but neither returned our request for comment. I'm Stephen Stock, NBC Bay Area News. Bay Area.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca, and sorry about the tech glitch in there for the public. Hopefully everyone was able, or most people were able to hear. If not, we will make a link available offline so that you can view the entire video with the sound. So members of the Environmental Quality Commission have seen a lot of this data before, but I thought that NBC video kind of pulled it all together well. On the left here, you can see a map of the bay as it is today with the blue areas, areas that are subject to flooding. And on the right is what we expect to see with 3 feet of sea level rise, which is, scientists are now predicting will happen sometime between 2060 and 2100. So as you can see, those blue areas come all the way up to 101, Route 101 and much of the peninsula. Next slide. If we zoom in on Menlo Park, again, on the left is today, you can see Belhaven and Facebook up kind of in the upper right-hand corner, and then what it would look like with 3 feet of sea level rise. So much of Belhaven is actually underwater, including around the Facebook campus and then the approach to the Dunbarton Bridge. Next slide. So the good news is the county has started putting together a plan, and this map comes from a feasibility study that was done looking into how we could build seawalls and levees to protect our little strip of bay coast. So this includes both Menlo Park and then right of the Dunbarton Bridge is East Palo Alto. They put together an estimate of what it would cost to build this combination of levees and sea level or sea walls, and their estimate, at least in 2016, for 3 feet of sea level rise is $100 million. That does not, by the way, take into account the latest estimates that it's possible we could be looking at 6 to 10 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. Next slide. Okay, so one consideration is, because for people who say, oh, we'll just build seawalls or levees, no problem. One consideration is if those levees were to fail, the human impacts in Belhaven would be devastating. So the county, in the county's report, there are 2,800 residents who live in Belhaven who would be at risk in a 3 feet sea level rise situation. You know, and here we can think of what happened in during Hurricane Katrina in the 9th Ward in New Orleans, where their levees broke and they had a catastrophic event which took lives and damaged a lot of property. So further, there would be this is again from a county report, 574 residential parcels would be inundated with 3 feet of sea level rise, 139 parcels. And then, of course, you know, the highest impacts here would be borne by the members of our community who live in District 1 and who are more likely to be lower income and also people of color. So this is just one example of the ways that climate change is not borne equally by everyone across society. It is, to a great degree, impacts those who have fewer resources and who have historically not had the same advantages as others in society. So those are sort of the human impacts. Economic impacts would be significant. The county, the assessed value of the real estate that would be underwater in a 3 feet sea level rise scenario is $1.3 billion. 20 miles of roads, including the Dunbarton Bridge approach, would have to be rerouted or elevated. Okay, next slide. So that's sort of what we're facing and the problem we need to solve for Menlo Park. Here's how it breaks out in terms of what are the primary contributor to global climate change is greenhouse gas emissions. So here's how Menlo Park's contribution to that problem looks. Right, today, we are emitting, according to staff reports, 284 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gases, about half of which comes from vehicles, and another third of which comes from natural gas. The green portion comes from our electricity, which that will be diminishing over time as Peninsula Clean Energy continues to source cleaner and cleaner electricity, more and more renewables, which I think their goal is by 2100 for all of the electricity that they source to be greenhouse gas free. And you can see waste there is just a very small sliver. Next slide. This is a picture of global greenhouse gas emissions. And one way that it's different, it just highlights something that we're not tracking at the city level, which, because we don't have heavy industry, the purple area here is something that we don't account for, even though our purchases, meaning chemicals, cement, metals, et cetera, actually do contribute to this purple wedge. It's just not something we track at the city level. Similarly, the green wedge here is from agriculture. We don't have agriculture within the city limits of Menlo Park, but clearly the purchases of our residents contribute to that green wedge. Next slide. This is a similar graph just for the state of California, just to give you another way to look at the problem. Here you can see that 40% of California's greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation, 21 from industrial. Residential and commercial buildings is that 9.7, the red slice, and we're going to be focusing quite a bit on that. Again, that in Menlo Park is about 34% of our emissions. Next slide. Okay, so in December, staff presented to City Council, and City Council expressed support for achieving carbon neutrality by 2030. So that would mean 90% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions and a 10% sequestration of our greenhouse gas emissions through direct carbon removal. So that would be through trees or sequestering carbon in concrete through some interesting new technologies. Next. So here's a graphic representation of the challenge. So we're trying to reduce 90% from our 2005 emissions, which were 349,000 tons. As of 2017, we were at about 284 tons. And now with this 90% reduction in greenhouse gases goal, that would put us in 2030 at 35,000 tons. Next slide. Okay, this is a 2-minute video produced by Sacramento's utility that just highlights some technology solutions to the problem. So we've been talking a lot about the problem, but the good news is we do have solutions. Businesses, technology has created every single technological solution we need to solve this problem. Now we just need to make the right choices. So here's this video just highlights some of those technological solutions that we have available to us.
Okay, we're gonna come right out and say it. We're your electric utility, and we want you to go all electric. But we have a pretty good reason for asking you to switch from gas to electrons. It can save you money, it's healthier, and it's safer. But the most important reason we want you to go electric is for the planet. Here in Sacramento, we care about our environment and are committed to a low-carbon future. That's why SMUD, Sacramento's community-owned, not-for-profit electric company, has pledged to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2040. Already about half of our power comes from non-carbon emitting sources, such as hydro, solar, wind, biomass, and geothermal. Thanks to these clean energy sources, electric power only accounts for a small portion of our state's greenhouse gas emissions, less than 10% from in-state generation, and just over 5% from importing electricity from other states. So, where do most of California's carbon emissions come from? The biggest culprit is transportation, which by itself accounts for over 40% of statewide greenhouse gases. The next largest source of carbon pollution is from industries such as oil refineries, cement plants, and large manufacturing. The third biggest source of pollution? The gas we burn for heating, hot water, and cooking. The rest of our state's carbon emissions come from agricultural practices, like raising livestock and operating farm machinery. The truth is, we can't slow down climate change unless we get out of the habit of burning fossil fuels to power our cars, homes, and factories. And while things like riding a bike to work are a great way to reduce your carbon footprint, it's unrealistic to give up using energy altogether. The good news is, there are many new alternatives to using gas power, and they usually come with a few extra perks as well. For instance, electric vehicles now have longer ranges, are fun to drive, and are often cheaper in the long run than their gas counterparts. Induction cooking technology not only offers faster and more precise cooking than gas stoves, but also greatly improves the air quality of your home. In fact, a home with all electric appliances saves 2.5 metric tons of carbon a year. That's like taking a car off a road for an entire year. Even better, new homes without gas lines are safer to live in and less expensive to build. In our next few videos, we'll show you sustainable technologies to reduce your dependence on gas and lower your carbon footprint. To find out how you can be a part of our clean electric future, visit smud.org/goelectric.
So that's an idea of what some of the solutions are. One thing I want to clarify is when SMUD, in the beginning of the video, when they were talking about their emissions profile of their electricity, ours is different. Ours is better. Theirs was sort of 50-50 clean. Ours is, I believe, 95% clean. So every time we switch from a gas appliance to an electric appliance in PCE territory, Peninsula Clean Energy territory, we're virtually eliminating the carbon emissions from that device. Okay, so good news. We have a plan. That's what the EQC subcommittee has been working on. And we reduce risk from sea level rise through bold leadership. That's sort of our only hope at this point, our only hope to actually have an impact on the sea level rise issue, since it is really a global issue. So that the challenge for us is to pass a plan and it be bold enough and replicable enough by other cities that it can actually set off sort of a cascade of positive action that could flow all the way up through the state of California and then to other states. As with the COVID crisis, early action is critical to saving our local community and our economy. So we're reviewing, EQC is now reviewing the plan, and then the idea is, based on our recommendation, it would go to council on July 14th. Next slide. Okay, so the subcommittee put together a plan pre-COVID, and we're all ready to show that to you, and then COVID struck. So that plan included a lot of suggestions from EQC members and staff. We reviewed probably 100 different strategies or actions for inclusion in the plan, and we boiled it down to 77 for our moderate plan. We read dozens of climate action plans from other cities to come up with ideas. And then we evaluated all those actions according to 6 criteria: potential greenhouse gas reductions, both for Menlo Park, and then we assigned a multiplier effect or a multiplier to those actions that we thought would be easily copied by other cities and therefore could have a broader impact on statewide greenhouse gas emissions. We also looked at the staff resources required for an action, the city's additional costs, maybe capital costs for an action, any out-of-pocket expenses that would be required from community members, political feasibility, and the potential for replication by other cities, which would impact the greenhouse gas reductions in that first bullet. Next. Okay, so for that pre-COVID plan, we'd come up with 3 different approaches: a bold plan, a moderate plan, and a go-slow plan. The bold plan had 22 actions and could be implemented in a year with about the equivalent of 6 full-time folks working on it. The moderate plan, which was, you know, the actions were not as bold, but there were many more of them, and it actually was more intensive from a staff perspective, but sort of helped the community take smaller steps toward this new way of making choices about appliances, for example. And then the Go Slow plan was basically just sort of following the state and trying to hit the state's mandates, but it wasn't very bold, and it wouldn't necessarily be a leadership plan. Next. Okay. So the X was because then COVID hit and we had to completely throw out that plan. So the post-COVID plan that we came up with had to take into account some new context. One is we're in the midst of a serious economic recession. rivaling the Great Depression. That has resulted in a budget shortfall for the city of Menlo Park, which at one point was $12.7 million. It's been resolved, it seems, by the city council through some pretty draconian cuts. So that was important for us in considering what might be feasible for climate. There's also new concern about lung health, which dovetails with some of the pollution impacts of, for example, gas appliances. So that's sort of a new awareness that I would say, since COVID is a respiratory infection. I think, and then of course we've had more recent events highlighting the racial inequality in our country, including here locally. So I think our plan always kind of had that lens, but that's just, I think, been heightened even further for me, thinking about the members of our community in Belhaven. And then, so with the new plan, we streamlined it from 77 actions to the 6 most critical. It means that the plan is less costly to fund. It's projected to achieve lower greenhouse gas emissions than our target. So the target is 90% by 2030. What we're proposing would only achieve about 47% reduction, which is actually kind of aligned with the state minimum. So it's not nearly as bold a plan, but there would be some actions that would be, you know, would provide leadership, I think, here locally, which we'll review. We did more analysis of the cost of inaction, just thinking about, you know, the financial investment versus the financial cost of not investing in a climate action plan now, even though funds now seem tight. We also assume that in the plan that I'm about to show you, that those additional actions, so the 71 actions that aren't in this plan but were in the original plan, would be considered in the future as funds become available, perhaps as soon as even next year. Next slide. Okay, so here's the plan. It's kind of an eye chart. I'm going to walk through a very high level the 6 actions in the plan. I hope you all maybe had a chance to read this in more detail in the memo. So the number 1 action would be to convert 100% of existing buildings to all electric by 2030. We passed a REACH code that applies to new buildings. This would be policy related to existing buildings. So we're calling this a burnout ordinance, which means not that someone has to rip out a perfectly functioning furnace or gas hot water heater, but that when that device reaches the end of its life, that the city would require that you replace it with an electric version. So these would be very high efficiency electric versions called heat pumps, which are much more efficient than traditional resistance heating devices. And so they, on an operating basis, they're very similar in cost to what their gas equivalents would be. And we, in meetings with, along with Menlo Spark, meetings with Peninsula Clean Energy, were able to highlight for them the value of offering a rebate to PCE customers to make this transition, to cover whatever delta they might find between a gas, for example, a gas furnace and an electric heat pump furnace or electric heat pump heater. And Peninsula Clean Energy actually just recently passed on May 28th a $6.1 million program that will provide rebates, starting first for heat pump water heaters. And there's a special carve out for low income households that would do whole home electrification. And there was, I think, $2 million set aside for the low income portion of the program. Number 2 would be to set a citywide EV goal. So this is not a program and it's not a policy. It's more just setting a goal for the city. For example, that by 2025, all new registrations in the city would be EV as opposed to gas cars. So no one would be buying and registering a new gas car in the city of Menlo Park by 2025. So the idea is to set a goal and to monitor it and track it and to sort of give the community a sense for where we're heading. So it's leadership, it's sort of projecting forward, this is where we're going, and inviting them to jump on board and be a part of progress toward the goal. And then reflecting back to people, you know, an increasing percentage of your community is buying EVs. Number 3 is expanding access to EV charging, which Rebecca and Candace have already been working on, especially for looking at installing EV charging in multifamily, where residents of multifamily can have challenges accessing EV charging because landlords make those decisions. We're also want to emphasize EV charging, placing EV chargers where they might be used during the day when we have abundant solar energy on our grid. And so it's important to be mindful of where we're siting those EV chargers. So that would be the city installing some of those EV chargers and also working with multifamily landlords or commercial businesses, you know, restaurants, grocery stores, other places where people might charge to get those EV chargers installed. Number 4 is reducing our vehicle miles traveled. So this is a number which is the the miles that our vehicles within the city travel during a given period of time, to take that number and to reduce it by 20%. That actually, you can see it reduces our greenhouse gas emissions by 30,000 tons, which is pretty big. To do that, we would recommend 2 strategies. One is to take another look at zoning and encourage high density development, especially housing near transit. So that reduces the number of trips that are taken versus housing that might be over on the bay, where people would likely have to use a car to get to any sort of transit or to get anywhere from that housing. Number 2 is making the city easier to navigate without a car by building out pedestrian and bike paths that are protected throughout town, and implementing the transportation master plan that's already been done. It hasn't been approved yet by City Council, but it's been done, it's been worked out. It currently is not staffed, so we would recommend that the 2 staff who are needed to implement that plan be staffed by, or be budgeted for the coming year. Number 5 is eliminate the use of fossil fuels from municipal buildings. So that's just the city looking at its buildings and all its assets and cars and coming up with a clear plan. They've already done this on their fleet for cars, but to do this for their buildings. So look at every every appliance that uses gas and have a plan for converting it over to electric. This would include the city's use of gas-powered gardening equipment, which we know that's an issue that many residents have expressed a concern about. For the whole community, this would be starting with the municipal operations. Number 6 is based on the video that we just saw. You know, there's sort of a question raised about why are we as a city allowing new development in areas that are likely to be flooded by the end of this century. So we're recommending a moratorium on building in those areas, since there would be city impacts to, you know, when the sewer stops working in those parts of town, you know, the city would probably be called upon to deal with the problem. So as taxpayers and as concerned citizens, I think there's a question about why we continue that. So we would recommend a moratorium on building in those areas until global emissions have stabilized at net zero. Okay, I'm sure we're gonna have a lot of discussion about this slide and all the actions that we're proposing, but that's the meat of the plan. Next slide. Okay, just a reminder, we're recommending a subsidy plus mandate option instead of just a subsidy only approach. Palo Alto has tried to convert, this is for the converting gas appliances in the community. Palo Alto has for years been trying to implement a subsidy-only approach, so offering community members a subsidy to convert when their water heater goes out, for example, to convert to a heat pump. And they've had a very low uptake on that. So they've come to the conclusion that it doesn't work. And we did our own modeling even before they came to that conclusion. We did our own modeling to see what would it look like if you just had a subsidy, even using very aggressive conversions, 10% in the first year and then increasing at 30% year after. You can look at the graph to the right. It takes a very long time to convert the fleet, and it certainly is not converted by 2030, which is our goal. Next slide. So that's why we're recommending the subsidy, which would be provided by PCE, plus a mandate, which would say, again, the burnout ordinance, which would say starting in 2021, which you can see on the left graph, the green bar, starting in 2021, you would have to install a heat pump version of gas appliances. So that means in the graph on the right, the fleet, which exists today, which is mostly gas, would come down pretty steeply. So we wouldn't exactly, assuming that most water heaters live for about 13 years, we wouldn't hit the 2030 goal of 90%, but we'd get close. Next slide. Okay, so some of the metrics, I think we were considering 40 or so metrics in earlier versions of the CAP, and we've narrowed it down to these, I think it's 8. The number of gas water heaters replaced with electric, the number of gas furnaces replaced with electric, the number of natural gas accounts terminated, new cars registered, and we can get this data from the DMV, EV versus gas in Menlo Park, total cars registered, EV versus gas, the percentage of municipal assets that have been converted from gas to electric, again, that's in the buildings and cars, vehicle miles traveled, which would include inbound trips, outbound trips, and trips within the city, and the number of cities that query or copy our climate policies and programs. That one's so critical because if we are measuring it, it's going to force us to make the policies and the programs that we're doing available to, whether it's through our website or available to other cities so that they can easily replicate them. Next slide. Okay, so this was some analysis we did, and it's an eye chart, you can't see it, but it basically revealed to us, we wanted to understand funding the CAP versus not funding the CAP economically. What is the value of that, of funding the CAP to us? And what we realized is if we fund the CAP to the tune of $1.5 million, the benefit to the city of Menlo Park is about $144 million. So that's a 100-fold increase on our investment in the CAP. And the reason that comes about is a series of, you can go to the next slide actually. I think back one. So we asked a series of questions. One question, should Menlo Park fund the CAP? And then we looked at a series of contingent and cascading probabilities of different outcomes. If we fund our CAP, would 20 other cities follow us? If 20 cities followed us, would the state then enact something similar? Which we're seeing that now with our REACH codes that we passed. About over 20 cities have followed suit, and now the city is the state is looking at bringing that into its next rev of the code, which it feels emboldened to do when a number of cities have passed those regulations. And then if California does something, there are about 10 other progressive states in the country that will follow what California does. And we can see this with CAFE standards and in our renewable portfolio standard. And then if the US were to meet its Paris, like if those 10 progressive states were to follow us, would we be able, the US, how much more likely would the US be to meet its Paris targets? And if the US meets its Paris targets, how much more likely is the world to then meet its Paris targets? So we assessed all those and came up with this, there's 64 different outcomes. And the expected value of funding the CAP was that we still incur a cost of about $1.27 billion. Sorry, if we fund the cap, $1.12 billion versus not funding the cap is about $1.27 billion. What's interesting there is it's the most likely scenario is that we end up actually losing a bunch of land to sea level rise, but we increase the odds significantly if we, well, I don't know if you would say significantly, but we increase the odds that we wouldn't have to do that by funding the cap and providing that leadership. Okay, next slide. So sources of funds, staffing is a big part of it. Staffing and capital are kind of the big ones here. So staffing, we believe that actions number 1, 2, and 3 can be led by our sustainability staff with help from the city attorney, building department, public engagement, and a contractor who's Candace. For 4.1, which is the kind of looking at the rezoning for transit-oriented development, community development would lead that and would either have to reassign resources or be given new resources for that. 4.2 would require unfreezing the transportation department positions to implement the transportation master plan. And Adine 11 has expressed, actually this was her request, and has expressed support for that. Number 5 would be public works, and they would need either to reassign staff or to be given more resources. Number 6 is looking at the moratorium, and our belief is that would require quite a bit of resources from the city attorney and community development, and then public engagement as well. So all of the above could be funded from the general fund, or so some of it would be covered already by current resources. Additional could be covered by the general fund, or there's $400,000 right now that's in the capital improvement plan that's been earmarked for the climate action plan that's been accumulating over a number of years. Next slide. Okay, so capital investments, we'd be looking at capital to spend on EV infrastructure, the street upgrades required as part of the transportation master plan, and electric replacements for the municipal gas and diesel assets. All of the above could be covered either by current capital budgets, or the council could amend the capital improvement plan to include these items. We are not recommending that the city council cover these capital items from the $400K that's currently earmarked for the cap in the CIP. Next slide. If there's a shortage of funds, for example, the $400,000 that's in the CIP can't cover the staffing needs, or there's a need for capital investment in the last slide that's not covered already in the CIP, another source of funds would be debt. So issuing debt or borrowing, and we are recommending that the council seriously consider that because we look at this as a one of the most prudent uses of borrowed funds that the city could implement, since it's benefiting future generations. Next slide. Okay, so these are COVID lessons. I think we've all, in the last couple months been taking them in. One is heed the warnings from scientists and experts. Humans have a hard time understanding problems of exponential growth. Exponential growth means a problem looks really small for a bunch of years, and then suddenly it does a hockey stick. COVID is like that, which is why so many states with just a few cases had a hard time reacting appropriately. And then suddenly, even now, have a kind of an explosive problem on their hands. Climate change is very similar. We see an inch or two of sea level rise, and then suddenly it becomes a foot and more very quickly. Acting earlier than what seems warranted leads to outsized benefits. So the early movers here, like South Korea, really saw great benefit from what they did. Often those people who move early, even the state of California, I would say, sometimes can get labeled as extreme or alarmist. But then after the fact, those sort of alarmist actors often look very prudent in a situation like this with exponential growth. The other thing I think we learned is that the public can actually make pretty drastic changes to behavior if leaders make the case and can make the case for why it's important and sort of point in a direction and give people very specific direction. Our best leaders are able to look over the horizon at coming risks and act decisively to prevent them. Next slide. So another lesson is for everyone who thought, oh, well, the federal government or the state government is going to save us, for example, in COVID. Well, I think we can see that that didn't happen. I think climate change is similar, right? There are going to be so many other parts of the country affected by climate change, probably even worse than we. And I think we would be viewed, since we live in one of the wealthiest counties in the country, as, you know, a place that can fend for itself. So I hope that's not the case, but I don't think we would be prudent to rely on the state or the federal government to sort of bail us out when it comes to the sea level rise issue. Thinking that we have to choose between addressing the crisis or protecting the economy, I think is flawed thinking. The sooner we address the crisis, the more we protect the economy. And then if we don't act swiftly, the economic consequences of delaying are going to dwarf any perceived savings that we have today from delaying, from putting off investing in solving the problem. So mitigation issues may seem super expensive right now, but they actually save us quite a bit of money in the long term. Next slide. Okay, and then another COVID lesson, leadership really matters. You can see this by, I think California took a leadership role within the US when other states were having a hard time deciding to do a shelter in place. We took that action. Even Menlo Park, I would say, led on that. Santa Clara County, their county public health officer really took a bold stand and I think saved a lot of lives. So South Korea showed us, again, what that looks like. And I think we have a similar opportunity with climate to set a bold example of what it looks like to start tackling this problem. Next slide. And then this is just a map of California's policies. It's something I referenced earlier. There are at least 10 other states that will follow our policies, or that have shown a willingness to follow our policies, copy them, and integrate them into their own. Next. Next. So finally, if we don't act swiftly, the economic consequences of delay are going to dwarf any perceived savings we have from delaying in the near term. Next. Okay, so this is just a slide for me to be able to take in any revisions we might want to make. That's the end of the presentation. The other thing I want to make sure that we discuss, so let's discuss the cap, and then I want to propose, and maybe this needs to happen at another meeting, but that we think about subcommittees. So the three people on the Climate Action Plan subcommittee have done a lot of work, obviously, together, but we haven't been able to share a lot of that with the rest of you. I think there are others on the commission who would be interested in jumping in and running with some of the things, at least supporting staff in moving forward with some of these actions. So I want to create an opportunity for that by setting, taking the 3-person subcommission and sort of spreading that out into several different subcommittees. So I'd like to discuss what those might be and who might serve on them. But again, maybe that's an item for another meeting. Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Josie.
Yeah.
I do think that may be a item for the next meeting. Sorry, my voice is all of a sudden quavering. It's probably because of the gravity of your presentation. So before we open it up to public comment, the first part that as commissioners, before we get to discussion, is to ask any clarifying questions. So as a commissioner, if you have a clarifying question to ask Josie or other members of the CAP subcommittee, now would be the time. Janelle.
Hi. First of all, that was an amazing presentation. I know you guys poured a ton of work into it and it really shows. It was truly excellent. So thank you for that. Really got, I think all of us, our heads in the right place around this. So thank you. I was just curious around the EV purchase requirement. Just if there were any thoughts around anything more specific than that. Is it like plug-in hybrids count? Is it new versus leased? I know I just saw a stat that like 28% of vehicles are leased rather than purchased. You know, anything around like specifics around that?
Thanks for the question. I want to just clarify, are you talking about Measure 5, the municipal vehicles, or were you talking about the community-wide goal?
Community goal.
Okay. So again, that's not a policy that we're recommending, and it's not even a program. It's just setting a goal and then visibly, like through the website or signage or, you know, radio or social media, updating people monthly or periodically, like, here's how we're doing on our goal. You know, this month, 30% of new registered vehicles were EVs, something like that. And I think we were just focused on the metric that could be supplied by the DMV. So I don't know that that breaks out by lease versus other. It does break out by plug-in versus EV, and I don't think we had contemplated, would we be showing just the metric for battery, battery or plug-in.
Okay, and it would be residents of Menlo Park who've registered their vehicles in the city, or anyone who's registered a vehicle in the city?
Yeah, my understanding is it's residents and then also commercial entities that have registered their vehicle with an address in Menlo Park.
Okay, thanks. I'll just note that while the DMV did have that data up, it appears to have taken it down off its website, which is super disappointing, and I don't know why it's down. Hopefully it's just temporary. Thank you.
Thank you.
You both. Are there any other clarifying questions from the commissioner? Yes, Rebecca.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for putting this together, by the way. I was really, really impressed by it. I just wanted to ask kind of like a clarifying question on how you calculated the GHG reduction tons per year for these different actions, because like a lot of them do seem sort of dependent on, you know, individuals just kind of like choosing to buy in. So obviously they must be like estimates, but yeah, I was just wondering like more about how you calculated that.
That's a great question. Tom, you want to take that one?
Sure. So what we did to calculate it, we looked at the latest data we could find on natural gas usage, electric usage, and the liquid fuels, diesel and gasoline usage. And then we would take a number of factors. Let's say for the electric vehicles, we were looking at applying factors to the total amount of gasoline usage, just by what percentage of folks would hear the message for the policy that we were looking at, and what percent of those folks who heard the message would act on the message and implement the transition. And so it's kind of a multi-step process, trying to look at how effective are you at getting a policy implemented and communicated, and then how much compliance do people provide with that policy, multiplying the factors together, and you end up getting amounts of cooperation and therefore reduction. That same type of method was applied to all the measures we were looking at.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in there that the mandates, right, that the like action number 1, we assumed high compliance because it would be the law. Whereas with the voluntary things, we had to make assumptions. And I think on that one, we made some pretty low assumptions about who would actually end up making a different decision.
Yeah, do you guys remember roughly like how many people you were estimating would like buy an EV in the next 5 years or so, like for action number 2, or like, I'm trying to look at what else would be like a buy-in kind of thing. Like, well, yeah, so I guess one question, like roughly how many people in the city were you thinking for number 2? And then, well, number 4, I guess, is harder. I don't know how you would like calculate that. But yeah, if you could just, I don't know if you guys remember like roughly the numbers you were thinking, but it'd be interesting to know.
I do not remember off the top of my head. I can try to pull it up if that would be useful. Like if you think it would inform your, you know, what you would recommend or your vote, I'm happy to pull it up.
Thank you. And I think we all appreciate how much work went into the presentation and understand that I know, at least for speaking for myself, I could never have remembered all of that. Even half of what you remembered would be a stretch for me. So thank you. Are there other clarifying questions? Yes, Janelle.
I was also curious as to how you calculated vehicle miles traveled.
So we actually didn't calculate that. That was a staff. Staff actually came up with what the vehicle miles traveled were for the last inventory that was done. Going forward, the way we would recommend it be tracked is actually through a tool that Google has developed for cities called the Environmental Insights Explorer. And we coordinated with them. They started with just 3 cities, and then about 5 months ago, they rolled in another 50 cities all over the world, and we were one of them. We asked to be one of them. So now with a click of a button, I mean, within like 30 seconds, you can see what Menlo Park's current VMT is. And then you can break it out by mode of travel and also inbound, outbound, and within the city. That's all available.
Is that from cell phone data? Or like Google Maps or something? Or Google, I don't know. Anyway, yeah, cell phone data basically.
That's my understanding, yes.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions, clarifying questions for the CAP subcommittee about their presentation? I do not see a hand. That being the case, Ms. Lucky, do we have any public comment on the consent calendar?
You got the notes there, but for this item, I just want to give a reminder to the attendees that if you wish to provide public comment on this item, so please raise your hand and I will be able to open up your microphone. If you wish to type in your public comment, you may also do that and we can read your public comment. If you have emailed before the meeting, I'll read your public comment to the EQC so that all the members of the public who are here can also hear the comments as well. And with that, we do have 3 attendees that have raised their hands. And the first is Jen Wollison, and I will open up the mic and you will have 3 minutes to provide public comment to the EQC. Hello, Jen. You may have to unmute yourself.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon, commissioners and staff. What an incredible work and care you have put into the climate action plan. And I just want to say how appreciative and a member of the community I am for your efforts, and agree that we'll take bold action and leadership to get this done. I also wanted to read you a letter from Medina Levin, who asked wasn't able to attend, who wanted me to share this with you. Dear commissioners and staff, First of all, thank you to the EQC for moving this forward at a difficult time during the pandemic recession, climate crisis not waiting. Second, thank you for including VMT reduction in the strategy, since transportation is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. The target of 20% VMT reduction. What is the source of this number? This is the question I had. This is lower than the target identified by a report required by SB 150 to assess California's progress on SB 350, Sustainable Community Strategy. That report concludes that even if the state achieves its EV goal and the share of EVs increases by 10 times by 2030, we still need to reduce driving miles by 25% to achieve our environmental goals. And she provided a report in case you want it. And then regarding the cost of achieving these goals, she's divided it into two things, land use and transportation. For land use, the city is already obligated to complete a housing element in the coming year that will zone for more housing, citing that housing near transit, jobs, and services will help reach that goal. Are there any staff resources needed above and beyond what is available for the housing element and other planning that would be needed to be approved in the revised budget? And then her other question or comment is regarding active transportation. And noting her appreciation of you including the 2 transportation staff positions that are currently frozen. But she also wanted to mention that at last night's city council meeting, there was a discussion of the additional funds that will likely be needed for the next fiscal year for many things, including the climate action plan, and that there seemed to be a great willingness on council to spend more money on climate action than was originally budgeted for. So she wanted to make sure you saw that. And finally, I would just like to add to Adina's points that I would like to see these things also, but we also want to see quick action. We don't want to be delayed. So I would urge you to move forward with the plan that you have and to look into her comments and other comments in tandem. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jen.
Okay, the next speaker will be Scott Marshall. Give me a second here. Okay, Scott, your microphone should be on. You may have to unmute yourself.
Okay, hello there, CAP subcommittee and members of the EQC. Thank you very much. Rebecca, did you say you would read an email we sent, or should I just, well, anyways, as a former member of the EQC and a current member of Canopy Advocacy Committee, I have observed the role of trees in our environment and its silent contributions to our surroundings. The benefits of trees are they sequester carbon, they retain moisture, they provide shade to reduce the urban heat island effect. The shade also helps reduce the need for energy consumptive air conditioning, provides habitat for wildlife, helps to recharge aquifers. Trees have many benefits, and I hope you include them in your plan. And I'm going to read one paragraph from my letter. One recommendation for the Heritage Tree Task Force was to develop an urban forest plan. This plan could set goals of increasing the urban canopy in all neighborhoods of Menlo Park. With a plan in place, the city arborists, businesses, developers, and residents could see the projected targets for the canopy growth and diversity. An approved master plan leads to coordinated planting of trees, which store increasing amounts of carbon over time. The city could partner with an organization like Canopy to add more trees in the urban forest and educate its public. Let me see here. While Menlo Park is in the process of developing a guideline to reducing carbon in the future, it could look at surrounding cities and see what they are doing towards carbon reduction. Maybe they could partner with these cities and have a plan to move forward. So I would like to say that an urban forest master plan would be a great addition to the carbon plan you're working on. and I would like to say on behalf of Canopy and myself, I recommend that Menlo Park incorporate Urban Forest Master Plan into its climate action plan to help reach its goals of carbon neutrality. Yeah, trees have a lot of benefits. I didn't see much in the report about trees, a few things here and there, but they don't cost much to plant. And once they're established, they just give the benefits of that I mentioned before. So please consider adding that Urban Forest Master Plan to your climate action plan. And thank you very much. And you did a great job. Thanks for all that work. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
Okay, the next speaker is Pam Jones. I am going to unmute you and you'll be able to talk, and you may have to unmute your own microphone as well.
Okay. Hi.
Oh shoot, Misty, sorry. Let me unmute you.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, wonderful.
Sorry.
Pamela Jones, I'm a resident in the Bellhaven neighborhood in District 1. And I want to thank the subcommittee and the EQ Commission and the EQ Commission for being so relentless with forcing the city to allow you to have a meeting. And so that this report could be presented. I'm also a member of Menlo Together, and I support the letter that was read to you by Jen Willison, written by Nadine Levin. And I look forward to your continued persistence to move in moving forward. And I hope a part of the plan will include methods in which to help residents, particularly in my community, to be able to afford to move to all electric appliances, particularly as well as having solar energy. I jokingly say that by the time all of this happens, I won't be driving anymore because I would hate to give up my car that I planned on driving for at least another 15 years. And it is very fuel efficient. But again, I'd like to thank you for the work that you're doing in addressing climate change. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam.
Okay, and then we also did receive emailed comments, and I will read through those. So the first was from Menlo Spark. And it states, "Dear Rebecca, Joanna, and EQC commissioners, I'm writing with enthusiastic support for the draft climate action plan. Several past commissioners are copied here. I know they'll be proud to see this draft plan. The Climate Action Plan Subcommittee has done phenomenal work creating a plan that matches the quality of what a large consulting team would produce, and remarkably produced it in a much shorter time frame. Although it may be disappointing to see the initial proposals for a stronger and more comprehensive set of measures pared back to meet this difficult moment, the draft plan wisely suggests revisiting those measures in future years as our economy and public health recover. The remaining core measures in the draft cap are the strongest and most appropriate areas of focus. Reducing fossil fuels, which will also improve quality and health. I also appreciate the additional information in the draft plan about how racial justice relates to climate and how the plan advances equity with the plan reductions in carbon pollution. It's worth noting that Menlo Park can achieve additional carbon reductions and improvements in resilience through collaboration with local agencies such as Peninsula Clean Energy and San Mateo County. I hope the draft cap will move forward to City Council for discussion and potential approval on July 14th as currently planned. Thank you for your expert work compiling a climate action plan that addresses the urgency of climate impacts and unique vulnerability of Menlo Park." And then we did receive another public comment through email from Mitch Slomiak. Dear Rebecca, Joanna, and EQC commissioners, Diane Bailey shared her excellent email of support with me, and I simply want to add my personal support as I endorse everything she says in her note. I read the original CAP that you all had hoped to move forward pre-COVID and the updated plan. While unfortunate that available city resources have diminished, you have done a commendable job determining the most significant measures that the city will be able to prioritize, fund, and staff. In addition, you have wisely included the full set of needed initiatives so that there will be a playbook available should federal and/or state funding for climate action initiatives become available in the coming years. I assure you that Menlo Spark will continue serving as a strong partner to the city during this time and will supplement city resources as we have done since our inception. Many thanks for all of your efforts. Former Commissioner Mitch Slomiak. And that concludes the public comments I've received.
Thank you, Ms. Lucky. Now it is time for commission discussion. So we can open up the discussion. Does somebody have a place they would like to start, or does somebody want to start the conversation?
I had a follow-up. I just looked up the number that Rebecca Turley was asking about. So Rebecca, our assumption was that 50% of the people in the community would be aware that Menlo Park had this goal, and that 9% of those people would then act on the goal. So purchase an EV based on this goal. So that is 743 residents would make a purchase of an EV that they otherwise wouldn't have made. So because the city is setting this goal and was making it public, et cetera, that was our assumption. So that's 9% of 50. So 4.5% or something of the city.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess now that we're moving into discussion, I wanted to kind of further just explore what Scott had mentioned. I wasn't sure, like he did mention that as part of the Heritage Tree Task Force, they were recommending this urban forest master plan. And I'm unaware of where that stands or if that was adopted, but I think it is actually a nice idea to incorporate some already existing efforts into the climate action plan to kind of, you know, show it brings in other efforts that we're already doing. And that one seems like, to me, like it could be sort of a low-hanging fruit without a huge cost. I don't know what kind of numbers that would do to reduce, but has there been any thoughts and like, have you guys been thinking about maybe incorporating something like that? Or I'm just curious what the group thinks about that.
I think, speaking from my own point of view, I think that I would be interested in having that in moving forward, but I want to echo what some of the public commenters said, and I think what the CAP committee has worked really hard to do, and it's kind of in the timeline, which is my hope personally is that we are in a position to recommend something coming out of this meeting so that it can go before council in July, so that we are making steps towards the progress, even if it means that we would be adding things in the future as was acknowledged in the proposal, given that we are now looking on a shorter time horizon for what the city can commit to due to the financial restrictions of the recession. So I support the intent and the interest in adding resources around the urban canopy. At the same time, I wouldn't want adding anything completely new to stop us from being able to move forward to make the timeline that we've proposed, when in fact we could come back and propose that addition in the future.
So I'll just add a couple things. One is I definitely want to support trees. We initially, with the 10% by 2030, the 10% remaining carbon that we plan to sequester, the plan was to look into perhaps planting trees in order to just a sort of high level number. In order to sequester 10% of our greenhouse gas emissions, you have to plant 3 million trees. So I went in thinking trees could be part of our carbon problem. And what I quickly realized was the amount of carbon that's sequestered by a tree is actually quite small. So you just have to plant massive numbers of them. And I think you all know in Menlo Park now, I think our urban canopy is something like 35,000 trees. So 3 million is like a couple orders of magnitude larger. We did in the original 77-point plan, we had a couple items. One was that, and the other was further developing the urban canopy in Belhaven, where it's quite different there than it is in the other parts of town, to provide those, protection from the heat island effects that are going to get worse with the increased heat of climate change. That didn't make the cut, but I think it's for sure could be something that we'd look at, when we're not in this like total budget lockdown situation. So it is in that 77-point plan. It will come back for discussion. It doesn't have a big greenhouse gas reduction. So I feel like we focused on those things where they're just big numbers for this round.
So I wanted to build a little bit upon what Josie outlined there. So we looked hard at trees, but we had to look at massive reductions in the carbon emissions, and there are so many great reasons to have trees. The trees have, quite a few amenities they're providing, but this was really a climate action plan. It wasn't to take into account the other attributes and benefits provided by attacking the climate problem. So where I do think that trees definitely have a big role, an urban forestry plan has a big role for Menlo Park, making it a pleasant community. It's just, it didn't meet the scope of what is needed in the climate action plan, so it didn't need to be pushing on the other things that had to be doing the reductions.
Yes, Janelle.
Is there if there's no further discussion around trees, I wanted to move to a different topic, but I'll wait until we've kind of closed out the discussion there.
Are there other comments on trees? Okay, we can move to a different dimension. Thank you, Janelle.
Sure. I wanted to explore the idea of adding a metric and a goal. And that would have to do with gallons of gasoline sold within the borders of Menlo Park. And so I know we have a goal around electric vehicles, and that's kind of a proxy for how much gasoline our city is responsible for. And I think it's a good proxy. It is a little bit, it could raise some equity concerns of people who are saying, who might feel like they can't afford to switch to an electric car, and they don't kind of get the credit for that if they end up riding their bike or taking the bus or even getting a more efficient vehicle. If we track and set a goal also around gallons of gasoline sold within city limits, we know that every gallon sold and burned is 20 pounds of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so I did share with the group some data gathered about how many gallons of gasoline we sell each year. And so I think, Menlo Park, when you guys were rightly talking about measures and metrics that we could inspire other cities to pick up on, this one is so important. Like we talk about transportation and vehicles, but what we're really talking about is gallons of gasoline burned and emitted into the atmosphere. And so if we could get cities starting to look at and try to reduce the number of gallons of gasoline they're selling within city limits, we could spark, pun intended, the real work here and a real measure of success. So I sent you guys a chart that showed that in California, our gallons of gasoline sold in the state have they've kind of plateaued. They are not going down like they need to. And so if we measure solely by electric vehicles, we don't know how many miles those vehicles are traveling. We don't know if they're displacing gasoline at all. But gasoline, we know and we can measure pretty much. I showed the California Energy Commission and the city of Menlo Park estimated two fairly different numbers. But if you take Menlo Park's estimate of 13 million gallons that we sell each year, we're enabling the burning of, and this is math, so catch me if I'm wrong, but it's 130,000 tons of CO2 emitted. If we can make a goal to take those gasoline sales down even 5% a year, and like with the electric vehicles, it's not a requirement, it's not a law, but we publish that and really highlight that, hey, anything you do to use less gasoline, that's good. We want to sell less gasoline here. So you ride your bike, you do this, you do that. Any measures that you do that use less gas are helpful, and we can drive that number down. I will say that currently, I just looked up that Google Environmental Insights document that you guys referred me to, and they say that when you translate our vehicle miles traveled into emissions, it's 311,000 tons. That's contrasted with the gasoline sales of 130,000 tons. So maybe where more people are driving around emitting than are actually buying gasoline in the city of Menlo Park. I know when I used to drive a gas car, I bought my gas in Redwood City. And then if you look at the 2017 inventory that Josie, that you popped up, it said 56% of our vehicles emissions was about 150,000 tons. So that's pretty commensurate with the gallons sold. Anyway, the point is that we don't want to be gasoline city. We want to be tree city. And if we just have an open spigot and endlessly serve up gasoline 24/7 with no attention to how much we're serving up or whether we're trying to reduce that number, we're missing a big opportunity, not only in our city, but to educate other cities that this is such an important metric that they've got to focus on.
Thank you, Janelle. Before we have, if it's okay, it's my fault. I was going to call a break for us all at just a quick break, like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, at the end of public comment, and I forgot. So I apologize for that. But if now is an okay time, I'd like to give everybody a chance to get a drink of water or whatever it is that needs to happen. So if we could call a break at 5:42 and return, let's say at 5:50. So it's like 8 minutes. Does that work for everybody? Okay, so we can leave the links open. You can stop your video and mute, and then we will come back to this meeting in 8 minutes. Okay, thank you.
Good evening. For those of you on phone calls, just want to let you know that the commission is taking a short break and will be returning shortly at 6:50.
I don't know if we're supposed to talk or not talk, but James, I'm very curious to hear about how your virtual trip to DC went.
It was, I mean, yeah, I also don't know if I should go into it right now, but it was very interesting, despite the truncated, limited nature of the trip. So, yeah.
Well, we can talk offline. I want to hear all the people that you met with.
I'll find my notes and read through them. Yeah, I still have to send a whole bunch of thank you emails. So good reminder.
James is going to get to meet with Markey, Senator Markey, big climate senator.
Oh my God, that's so awesome.
The whole trip got a little messed up by COVID. It was supposed to be like a week-long trip in DC, meeting with all these people in person, but instead it was a shorter trip, meeting virtually with a whole. So we met with some of his staffers. We met with Scott Peters, who's a California rep, and some miscellaneous other people. So
that's very exciting. Well, I know we'll look forward to hearing about it in the future. In the present, we can return to our discussion. So where we left off was, I think, Josie, you had a comment right after Janelle had finished talking about introducing a metric around gasoline purchased in the city of Menlo Park.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I would support that. And thank you, Janelle, for bringing it in, because it does it's a little bit of a different lens. So I think it's worth adding to our list of metrics. I think the other question I had back to you was, were you thinking it would be added into action number 2 as well, where we're setting a kind of a community-wide goal that we're then like promoting and doing advertising around too?
Yeah, I think that might be a good place for it. I, like so many of the people who commented, I am very interested in seeing this move forward today, so I don't want to hold things up. However, I do think it would be amazing to include this. And yeah, I think it could be included in number 2. So it's another metric that we publish and talk about and raise awareness around. It's one that even more of the community can engage in, because whether you can afford an electric car or even drive a car, you can help burn, well, I guess if you don't if you don't drive a car, you're not going to be participating. But anyway, you can burn less gas regardless of whether you can buy an EV. So it's nice that way. And it will also be path breaking. So my nonprofit's done a lot of research into this. And right now, cities are using electric vehicles as kind of a proxy for gasoline burning, but not really having any idea how many gallons of gasoline an EV is actually displacing. Meanwhile, they've got the data right there. The gasoline is, when it's getting pumped, it's getting burned and it's going into the atmosphere. So I think if we again would be recognized as a real leader in this, and if we can get surrounding cities to start measuring these gasoline sales, it will tell a very clear story of where people are going to buy their gasoline and who's successfully depressing those sales, and whether other cities are allowing their sales to climb, which would be embarrassing, or if they're also aiming at measures to reduce gasoline sales.
Yeah, I see good reasons to add that to both the list of metrics. So it would go from 8 to 9 metrics, and also to action number 2. So I would support that.
Okay. And I'll just say the city's public fleet already adopted a goal of 5% reduction in gasoline usage per year from a 2018 baseline. So we could set a similar goal for Menlo Park, the city as a whole, which would actually be in keeping with the IPCC recommendations of about 50% reduction by 2030.
Okay, so if we set a goal, 5% reduction per year.
We don't have to do that, but I'm just saying that's something that the city of Menlo Park already is doing for its public fleet, and it's IPCC friendly.
Yeah, for the purposes of this meeting, if we can, I think 5%, I saw that the info that you sent, I think 5% is reasonable. And so I would be happy to amend the draft cap to include that. But I do want to hear from other people in case other people disagree. But
I would be supportive of that. It seems like it could be added in that way into the cap. Tom, you were interested in making a comment.
Yes, I would support it also as a metric to track the number of gallons sold. But in order to try to hit the greenhouse gas reductions that the plan is aimed at, it would need to be more than 5% reduction to be in scale with the other things. Essentially getting down to being only 10% of its former value. So it needs a relatively steep decline, math to be provided, but it's steeper than 5.
Okay, good to know. Yeah, sorry, I forgot about the fact that we are aiming for very ambitious goals, and we should. So that's awesome. Thanks.
I had wanted to raise a different topic. So if anybody else wanted to speak further about the gasoline sale, I want to allow that first. Does anybody else want to talk about that? I think we may have lost Rebecca for a moment. Okay, so I don't think so. So I was going to raise, I don't know. So 2 things. I think that I agree with a lot of the comments that have been said around trying to balance between the climate emergency that we are in, and at the same time recognizing the difficult decision that the city is in, and the difficult choices that the city has been asked to make recently or needed to make. At the same time, I did really appreciate, Josie, in the presentation when you talked about the economic value in the long run. And I think one of the organizations that has demonstrated this really interestingly, it's not around climate change specifically, but it is around creative ways to increase access to capital for projects that need to happen now, is the Ford Foundation. So there was a big article about the Ford Foundation actually being able to give out more of their endowment, not by paying out from their endowment, but by borrowing against it because interest rates are so low. And so again, if there's ways for us to continue down a bold path and recognize the economic conditions the city is facing, I would be really supportive of as bold a plan as possible, understanding the limitations the city is facing, at the same time pointing to leadership action that's been taken by organizations like the Ford Foundation to highlight the need for urgent action. There's a specifically to address some of the issues around race and injustice and the COVID impact. However, I think you could, as we know, we could say the same types of things about climate change. And so I just wanted to call that out as an area. It's less about the cap itself and more about overall goals, and then ways to approach the financing and how to make that recommendation to the city council. Yes, Josie.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And I read that. I think it was a New York Times article on there's like 4 big foundations that are doing this for the first time. Super interesting idea. Businesses do it all the time, right? And Menlo Park does have reserves that it could potentially borrow against at a very low interest rate. So we did include that slide in there about debt, but we could refine that recommendation and point the council members toward this article about what the foundations did. So it's a good idea.
Other items for discussion?
Yeah, I wanted to raise the point that Adina Levin brought up in her comment about the VMT reduction target of 20%, and she linked that report done by CARB that was suggesting a reduction target of 25%. And I just wanted to, I would be supportive of changing from a 20 to a 25% target. So I just wanted to hear everyone else's thoughts on that.
I can put that up too, James. I think it'd be nice to be in sync with them if that's what they're also recommending. That shows that we're, kind of working across committees to come up with, reasonable, whatever the latest data is saying. So I was going to ask that question too, so I'm glad you did it, but I don't know if others felt like when they read that kind of made sense to me. It's like, I don't know how the 20% number came up, but if it's, and I don't know if, I have no sense of if 20 or 25% is how feasible it is, because that part I didn't really kind of get into how we determine if, how to do that, because I always find vehicle miles traveled to be extremely challenging, coupled with the fact that we're in a COVID situation, which is very atypical, and coupled with the fact that I keep hearing things like, cars are not being used right now, but then people are also, when we presumably get back to work and everything else, people are very nervous about taking public transportation. So there's this kind of fear that there's going to be like a massive influx of car travel. So I'm just kind of wondering how we normalize that in this very unpredictable time, or if you've thought about that at all.
Josie, yes.
So it was a good question. I'm familiar with the report that Adina provided, and I've known about that 25% number for a while. Originally, we actually asked the Complete Streets what they would recommend, and they were hesitant to give us a number because they felt like they needed transportation staff to look at it, and they didn't have bandwidth for that. We, the subcommittee, are not VMT reduction experts. So with the 25% number in mind and looking at cities all across the world that are setting goals for VMT reduction, Copenhagen, for example, set a really steep goal, 50% reduction in a very short period of time, and achieved it. then we kind of looked at Menlo Park, and we're not a city in the same way. We're more suburban. And then just sort of talking to other stakeholders, the Planning Commission, about the rezoning and how feasible that would be and how receptive, kind of taking the temperature of Menlo Park as a community. How much density are we going to tolerate in our downtown versus what a city like Copenhagen was willing to tolerate, for example, like bike and pedestrian paths. European cities are very, very friendly toward setting aside land for those. Menlo Park, it's a very, very touchy subject. So I think the 20% number is it's subjective. It's sort of, 25% would be the best. And given the culture in Menlo Park politically, maybe all we can do is 20, but I'm okay with setting a bolder goal, and maybe we'll achieve it, maybe we'll fall short, but especially if Adina and the Complete Streets Commission feels like that's that should be the goal, which is kind of what I was hearing in her communication, then I would be in favor of using that one instead.
No.
I'm fine with either goal. I think that the metrics are going to really make it hard to figure out if we've actually done it or not. I was just looking at that Google Environmental Insights Explorer, and the way they calculate the vehicle miles traveled is they estimate the mix of vehicle and fuel types, so that's an estimate, and the energy consumption of buildings, okay, and they apply standardized greenhouse gas emissions factors per type of vehicle, type of fuel, or electricity generation. So they're deriving this from some, I think, much larger data sets, so that it would be incredibly hard to tell if we were actually reducing vehicle miles traveled within our city. So that concerns me quite a bit. I've never seen a VMT calculator that is actually accurate or based on anything other than very broad aggregated data.
I know I would just add context to what Janelle's comment is as well, which is we've had this conversation several times about the VMTs, even looking at the past CAP plans. And I think what I appreciate about the tool that Google has put forward is that it at least doesn't require a significant investment of city staff and time to go and calculate something, because we are able to have it calculated essentially in real time. So we have yet to find a solution that we like in terms of the degrees of accuracy. And to me, what's nice about this solution is that it is such a significant factor for the city in terms of figuring out how to address vehicle miles traveled. And at the same time, this is an easier way for city staff and for commissioners and even the public to familiarize themselves with the data, so that we could in fact see what changes are happening, even though, to your point, if the data sets are larger, it's potentially not something that you could really see in the information. I don't know if anyone else had thoughts on this, but I do think that it's an important metric. Tom?
I agree, it's an important metric, and as Josie relayed, we did seek other input on it, and it didn't, we just didn't get it in time, so we had to do what we could. But perhaps it would make sense to put in the recommendation to the council that a VMT target developed by a commission be adopted, and that if the Complete Streets Commission is able to do that, that would be the ideal place for it to happen, and in my opinion.
Thank you, Tom. Deb?
Yeah, I just think I can't imagine our CAP plan not having VMT, just because vehicle emissions are such a big factor. So we know that we need to, like, EV is one thing, but we know we need to actually reduce the amount of vehicles traveling. So I do think even if the data is not ideal, hopefully it'll get better over time, but I think it's a really critical part. And I want to see it also, again, shows the bridge between us and Complete Streets. And aside from the climate impact, it's also a very important factor for the city. It's a nuisance factor. There's many people who are focused on the emission, like the vehicle travel in our city. So I do think, even though it's a challenging one, I think it's a really critical one. So I would kind of just, you know, concur with what you're all saying, even if the data is hard.
Thank you, Deb. Oh, there's Josie. Okay. Yes, Josie, go ahead.
I guess I'm hearing two proposals, and I want to test out which one people are landing on. One is we keep it at 20 and say maybe 20%, or a goal to be set by the Complete Streets Commission, which they could come back with 25 or 30 or whatever they come back with once they feel like they have the bandwidth to, you know, feel confident about the goal. Or we could just change it from 20 to 25 in the plan that we give to council. And I want to see, which do people prefer?
I thank you, Josie. I just have a question for Rebecca Lucky. How does Josie's proposal or the question impact the staff report that would have to accompany the EQC's recommendation to council?
So in regards to increasing the reduction?
Yeah, the VMT question, exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, I have to talk through with Public Works and Transportation on what that would look like some more. But I mean, those are things that we were going to have to work on regardless of whether it's 20% or 25%. So it's just adding this other layer. So don't see it being too much of an issue besides the fact of figuring out how we're going to get to either one of those goals.
Thank you. So going back to Josie's question, from the commission's point of view, what are people's thoughts around the two different kind of scenarios that Josie was outlining based on what we're hearing from this meeting?
So perhaps we could have it be saying that we would propose paralleling the statewide 25% VMT reduction, and looking forward to having that examined and recommended, you know, some level examined and recommended by the Complete Streets Commission at a future date.
Sorry, James. Yes, James, I forgot to unmute.
That's okay. Yeah, I was going to recommend the same thing Tom just said, which is sort of a hybrid of the two Josie said before, but like you said, prior to obtaining specific input from Complete Streets, parallelizing it with the state goal, and then saying we defer to Complete Streets if they find a target that they feel fits our city better.
I like that idea. I mean, I think they should align. So I do think that that's important language.
I'm supportive as well.
Same.
That sounds good to me. So what I have is we would change it to, and I don't have, hold on, maybe I can pull up the language that's currently there. 1 second. So it'd be reduce VMT through a two-pronged approach. Actually, so it would be the action on the left. Reduce vehicle miles traveled by 25% in accordance with state goal. And defer to Complete Streets
if they have a higher goal that they feel better fits the city. Is that helpful?
And maybe rather than higher, it's just a better goal.
Sure.
Don't know which way they would go.
Okay.
And thank you, Rebecca, for putting back up the presentation on the plan. I think there was another area that we were discussing around. So if we're finalizing the feedback and I'm not trying to cut the discussion short so we can continue it, but we would also be, as Josie pointed out, we probably want to hear a summary of the number 2 item where it addresses the, I'm totally blanking, the gasoline purchased in the city.
Yeah, so what I have for that one is, so we change it to announce and promote a citywide goal of making all new vehicles be electric by 2025 and track progress publicly on a monthly basis. Also announce and promote a citywide goal of reducing gasoline sales by, and it's somewhere between 5 and 10% per year.
Tom, did you ever come up with a percent?
I did not.
Okay. And then on the action, should we call it set a citywide EV adoption and gasoline sales reduction goal or goals?
So in the action column to expand it to reflect both items.
Yeah.
And in terms of a percentage goal, Rebecca, going back to Rebecca Lucky, looking back at the staff's discovery process, would that be something that was work that would be addressed in the staff discovery process for the staff report? Or is that something that we should work to finalize a specific metric on this call?
So staff can work to finalize the details through it. I think we just need the high level kind of guidance and vision that you're seeking.
Okay.
I'm no math expert, but Tom said we have to get it to basically 1/10 of what it is. So is that 10% a year from like a 2018 baseline? So we don't keep shrinking the amount we have to reduce it by. It's always starting with 2018. So if 2018 is 100, then it's 90 the next year, or 90 in 2021, 80 in 2022, 70 in 2023, like that. Will that get us there?
I think that'll get us there. And depending on when it passes, yeah, that'll probably get us there.
I mean, good luck, right? Like, this is not easy stuff, but at least as far as a goal, if we can keep holding ourselves and say, okay, we missed it for last year, now we're going to have to double down for this year. Really, folks, we cannot keep buying this gasoline or selling it or whatever.
Actually, when I do the math, to go from 100% in the first year to the to 10% by the 10th year, it's, it is about 20% reduction every year would be the smooth reduction.
Wait, but always from the 2018 baseline?
No, that runs from a rolling baseline of the year before.
Yeah, I don't want to give ourselves any credit for having, if we screw up the year before, we don't get an easier target. We just have to, this is what the teacher cares about, like, start with the 2018 baseline and stick with it, and that's the...
Okay, and then have a constant number of gallons reduction, essentially.
It would be a percent of, 10% from, yeah, you're right, it is. It is a constant gallons reduction.
Okay.
So would 9% times 10 is 90%? So does that that work?
That would do it.
Okay, I do not trust my own math.
I think that would, go ahead.
No, sorry, you go ahead, Josie.
I was going to say, yeah, I think by the time we get this passed, it'll be about 9 years. So I think if we say 10%, I think that's good. Yeah.
A question with that. So I like the idea of that goal. I'm just trying to think of the how behind it, because it would, in my mind, it requires a change of behavior of the citizens. So you either incentivize them to buy more EV vehicles or promote more use of bikes or maybe scooters, or like, I think if the city wants to see a reduction in gas, we don't want that to just sort of magically happen. There has to be some kind of either outreach effort or so maybe we're not getting that granular right now, but I think it's important if we want to see a reduction in gas, we have to explain somehow how it's going to how we can influence that. Otherwise, it's just subject to the market, like just subject to whatever's happening out of our control. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so my thoughts are that every program that we implement to reduce gasoline use should be aimed at reducing gasoline use. And this is a test of, is it working? Like, okay, we're making more bike lanes. We are encouraging transit. We are doing infill. Are all these things working for the goal that we wanted, which is there's less gasoline being burned?
Josie?
Yeah, I also want to point out that this is a little slippery. This one is not a policy and it's not a program versus like number 3, which is a program, right? It's like building out the EV infrastructure, EV charging infrastructure. Number 2 is just setting the goal for the community and marketing it and advertising it and hoping that 745 people at the end of 10 years will have bought an electric car who wouldn't have otherwise. And there are obviously tons of other market forces that are coming into play here, right? So more product offerings, marketing by the automakers who are offering EVs. So there are a lot of other factors. Janelle's right. We have sprinkled throughout. We do have programs and policies that are part of the CAP, the increasing the protected network of bike and ped paths, doing more transit-oriented development. So the EV charging infrastructure build out. So we do have other things that will be contributing that, but number 2 is really just setting the goal. And I think there's value in just setting the goal, sort of taking a proactive leadership approach and educating people about the goal, that will influence some people, just the setting of it. We can, of course, in that marketing effort include and here are all the links to the rebates that you can get. So making people more aware of those. But number 2 is mostly just it's like a marketing and leadership action.
Well, if that's the case, just food for thought, rather than focusing it on purchasing of electric vehicles, couldn't you make it more of a broader goal to not have not be driving gas vehicles? So whether that be you buy electronic vehicle, whether you start biking to work, you're taking transit, you could come up with whatever. I'm on a call. Sorry. Oh, thanks. Whatever, it could be a combination of things, could be 5 different things, but it doesn't have to just be buying an EV, you know what I'm saying? So I'm just wondering whether we already have expanding EV charging, which is good, but should this other one just be, instead of setting a citywide EV goal, should it be setting a citywide no petroleum vehicle goal, and that can be achieved in a number of ways? Just thinking about it. Maybe it's too.
Josie?
Yeah, so Deb, I think you're right, and that's the improvement that Janelle was recommending which is changing this action to set a citywide EV goal and gasoline sales reduction goal. So I think that second piece would address the other part. Yeah,
I just want to make it, so I guess what I'm saying is if you tie it with gas, you're kind of just giving this idea that it's all about vehicles of some sort. And I'm just saying that maybe there's a little way to tweak the language to say, hey, think about other modes of transportation. And that way it just is a little bit more inclusive, and it offers other modalities rather than just kind of getting the length. Because when I read that, I think that's either petroleum gas or EV, and reducing gas, I'm still thinking vehicle. So it just maybe be a little bit of how it's worded to make it more there's multiple ways the city can go about reducing gas, right? So it could be a little word tweak, but I think it would be interesting to, especially if we're trying to promote more biking, more, use of transit and bus, whatever. It could, that way people would feel like they could fit into that.
I love your idea of kind of spelling out the how. I kind of envision that might be in the communications pieces around this goal. So really the goal is we want people to understand that it's the burning of gasoline that's the problem for the climate. That is the problem. It's not that, oh gosh, if only there were more EVs on Earth, the world would be a better place. That's not it. The whole point is reducing how much of this fossil fuel we're burning. And so if we have that as a goal and then have as recommendations, there are so many ways that you can help with us buying and burning less gasoline. Then I think it would meet your very good point that we need to explain the how of this.
So the way so I want to take a step back and just say what I'm hearing from this, and I think the only question I would have is each number plan is also tied to metrics. And so when you talk about biking and other things, I think my question, it's not that I don't think that that is a good use of energy, like good people's use of good energy around cutting down on gasoline usage. But my question would be, how is it tracked? And so I work at Stanford, and one of the things that they do is every year they survey all employees around how you commute. And the options include walking, they include biking, they include the shuttle service, they include basically a huge range of options. But it does require that effort annually to track that so that Stanford can understand the impact of the different types of transportation that staff and members of the community are using to access campus. And so the only question I would have is, what is it that we would be measuring to address the goal? Or do we see these choices as adding to the reduction of gasoline sales? In which case it's more around, here are different ways you can contribute to the city's goal of reducing gasoline spend.
Just my feeling about that, quite simply, is to add a metric, just like Janelle suggested, showing the reduction in gas use, because then you're contributing to that however way. You can still, we have 8 metrics here, some around EV, which still addresses number 3, because that's kind of, then we're capturing EV in 3, but in 2, it would be like just simply gas reduction. And however that's achieved, we don't have to really figure that out. Like, we don't have to survey people. We don't have to just look at the amount of purchases of EV to figure that out. And I think it just broadens it, and also takes in, what I like about it is taking a lot of other efforts that we have, complete streets, we have, all these other things that kind of fold in, and it makes it, to me, seem more broad and more sort of factoring in other missions that the city has. So that's how I would do it. I mean, I would just make it a gas metric.
Great. So
Janelle, do you agree with that, or?
I do like it. I guess the one thing that I would say about keeping an EV goal is that it is true that registrations of EVs actually happen in the city. The way the gasoline metric works is when you set it and you're a leader, and so other cities around you also start to set that goal, and you can trace where are people going, because you can drive outside the city and get gas. It's kind of a hassle. You'd rather get it, well, for some people it's a hassle, for some it's not. But if we and Redwood City and Mountain View and Los Altos all start reducing our gasoline sales, it's going to become very obvious if somebody's not participating, and they're going to kind of get shamed into, hey, why aren't you reducing why is everyone going to you to buy gas? Maybe you should install EV chargers at your Costco so that everyone can see, that EV chargers there, or whatever the measures are, but you start to be able to tell a complete story.
Yeah, and just to be clear, I wasn't suggesting we remove any of those metrics around EV. I think we keep it and add gas. So like, it just is a sort of a, yes, I agree with what you're saying there. And we would not replace any of those. We would just simply add in like a gas metric.
Yeah, okay. I think that was what was being proposed anyway. So yeah, I think we're.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure if I guess I'm
that's okay.
Zoned out for a minute. I didn't know that we agreed that we would add that, but I do like if we can just maybe broaden action 2 to give a little bit more flavor of it, not just being about EV, but it's that we're trying to really, that's what I would.
Like all modes of the description could include, sorry about my voice, all ways in which you could reduce gasoline sales in Menlo Park. And one of those ways could be, one of the ways we would like to call attention to, let me say, would be by choosing an alternative method. So if you don't have an EV and you could use only bicycles or only, a one wheel, we don't care, to get around the city, for example. So that makes sense. So slightly altering the description and then adding a additional metric around gasoline sales, but leaving the EV metrics in. And then are there any other thoughts or discussion around amendments or modifications we would like to have before we make a motion, or before there's a motion to on this plan.
Yeah, I had a comment. 'Cause to me, it seems like we could set a citywide EV goal and totally agree with what you guys said, that should be more inclusive, like biking or take bus or walking. But isn't that more in line with number 4? Like, couldn't we just say reduce vehicle miles traveled by, gas car or something, and then have that one be more about just like changing your mode of transportation? And even if you can't, afford to buy an EV right now, like maybe you don't use it all the time, like you just cut back on your usage, and you are using a bike or walking or taking public transit. So I really like this idea, but to me it seems like it falls more under 4, and I don't know if that would like mess up how we get the metrics for that, because I know it's probably not like what we're initially thinking and like the state's language or on that. But yeah, to me, like I like having just the EV goal as its own thing, because a lot of people do just have cars, but this, I don't know, the spirit of this seems more in line with 4 to me.
Are there follow-up comments about Rebecca's comment? Josie.
Yeah, but I think you're right. I think the actions, the things that are the policies and the programs that are being promoted under number 4, the result of them is to get people out of their cars and walking and biking and doing those things. And so I do think it addresses, especially what Deb was raising. How do we succinctly, number 2 is really just like a marketing effort, right? If you can imagine like a radio spot or on the city's website, a banner that says, hey, this month we achieved, registrations of 25% EV or something like this. We're approaching our goal for 2030. Or it could also be a banner that says, we reduced our gasoline sales this month by X%. I think we're contemplating that sort of resetting of the goal. So number 2 is just sort of a marketing effort. Number 4 is policies and programs to support. Number 3 is to support EVs. Number 4 is to support reducing gasoline sales from switching modes. I'm happy to change the goal. One thing that could happen, we might get pushback by setting a prominent goal of gasoline sales reduction, pushback from people who feel threatened by that. Whereas like sometimes setting the goal, which is the positive thing, like switching to EVs, feels less threatening than, cutting your gas. That's a possibility. The other threat that people might feel is, there's some sort of city tax that we collect from gasoline sales. People may feel threatened by that. I'm not saying that's a reason to not do it, but we could get pushback on that. So I'm fine if there's consensus, including reducing gasoline sales in our marketing effort, like making that a kind of a point to emphasize. And I think maybe the exact wording of that, I don't know, do we have to agree on it now, or could I work with Janelle and Deb, who seem to be most interested in this, to kind of come up with that right language?
I think in order to make the timeline of a recommendation coming out of this meeting, we would have to have it done in this meeting, or else it has to come back to us to get voted on again. But what I just had one comment on this, which is it sounded like there was 2 separate issues. One is adding the metric of the gasoline sales to number 2, and the other is under number 4, highlighting the fact that although it's implied in, if you are familiar with the Transportation Master Plan, that the Transportation Master Plan updates were relating to improving the pedestrian and bike experience throughout Menlo Park. But for people who are either not aware of that or whatever the case may be, it could be helpful to highlight that as part of the statement, but under number 4. So the ways in which you could reduce vehicle miles traveled are distinct from what I heard from the group was distinct from where the metric tracking and what the metric tracking of reduction in gasoline sales is applied to, which would be to point 2, not point 4. And I think Deb had a comment.
Well, I actually really like Rebecca's idea of moving it in 4. I think that actually, you know, she's right. It does actually accomplish the same thing, and maybe, you know, kind of keeps that marketing focus on really something very tangible, like I can buy an EV, and that's like something that the city wants me to do, and you can get a lot of, you know, splash out of that. So, but I think you can also accomplish the goal in 4 of saying, well, these are the ways I contribute because I ride my bike. So, like, you know, I actually think that works, and maybe we just need just a little tweak of the language to make people understand that's what we're like. You know, I'd have to look at it again, but I think that works actually. And then the other thing I was going to say about the gasoline, because first of all, I think you guys did a fantastic job with this. I think it's totally right sized for where we're at right now, and I completely fully support it. I read it and I thought it was fantastic. So I'm really motivated to, you know, kind of move us forward with recommending this. If we feel like the gas sales is maybe problematic, the other thing we could think about is these are, you know, you can have externally facing metrics and then you can have internally facing metrics. So this is something that Rebecca and, you know, the sustainability, like we could be still looking at, but it doesn't have to necessarily be, if we think it's political or is going to kind of cause problems, you can still capture the data and have that be something that you're using internally to track how it looks at externally. You know, we do that all the time in corporations, right? We do external metrics and internal. So I would be supportive of that too. If, you know, if we feel like the gasoline is going to be a problem, and if we feel like it's not a problem, we could add it into. So I think maybe that's the bigger ask is around, do we add the metric or do we not? And I think we're capturing it in all the goals.
Janelle.
Yep. Okay, so there is a huge problem with VMT, just kind of trying to put gallons of gasoline sold in with VMT, and that VMT is a horrible metric. It is not precise, whereas gallons of gasoline sold, the gas stations have to track that precisely. So, so there is a merit to that. Ultimately, regardless of how uncomfortable people are at first, we're going to have to get rid of our gas stations. And guess what? That opens up a huge opportunity to add housing that people are screaming for. Like the benzene coming from those gas stations is actually carcinogenic. There's a lot of downsides to it. And ultimately, we're going to have to wrap our heads around the idea that the gas stations aren't going to be a source of income, but that's okay, because if we replace them with housing, it will be more income, much more. And so I wonder if it would be possible just to put in the gasoline sales metric as another number. Are we committed to keeping it at 9, or could we just pop it in there? We can make it like the EV sales, where it's just a goal. It's a thing that we're measuring, but it doesn't get subsumed under something that's very hard to measure. It's rather a very easy number to get exactly right.
Okay, so so we have different points of view on where a metric to track gasoline sales would live. I think I do agree that the data is a lot clearer and more specific. And to me, that's why it lived with the registration data, because that data is actually really specific and concrete and clear for Menlo Park specifically, and has to do with our world. Whereas the VMTs has to do with a lot of things that we choose to put in our world, but also things like the 101, which we don't. And so it's, to me, that feels similar. So I think we have to come to a decision if we'd like to leave the meeting with a proposal on where we want to include the metric and what phrasing we want to address as part of, for people who are public transit, or they're not necessarily going to buy an EV. Instead, they would choose a different way to get around that's non-car based. And how do you acknowledge them in this CAP proposal? I also think separately from that, just to introduce another dynamic, I think it would be helpful to hear if there's any discussion around item number 6, and to talk a little bit about our expectations for community engagement. So
to close
ahead.
out, or to propose a way to close out number 2, first of all, on our metrics, which is completely separate, yes, we should add a gasoline sales. So from 8 metrics to 9 metrics. I propose that. And I would guess that everyone agrees with that. In terms of what we promote, so in that number 2, which is this marketing effort, right? I would be okay adding gasoline sales to that. So that's going to be like, we're showing, you know, we're announcing numbers. Hey, we reduced by this amount. Everyone, let's get excited about this. I'm fine with that. It's very low cost. There's not a lot of extra staff effort to it, I don't think. So I would say that's fine. And then in terms of number 4, we do have language in 4.2. It says, make the city easier to navigate without a car by accelerating implementation of the Transportation Master Plan with an emphasis on developing a clear network of protected pedestrian bike paths throughout the town. So Ryan, you were worried that like that wasn't sort of spelled out in number 4, I think. But I think it is, which because that text is so small, it might have been hard to see. So if we want to, we could add language to the description of number 4 from reduce VMT through a 2-pronged approach to reduce VMT, especially from that gas vehicles through a 2-pronged approach. Or we could leave that phrase out.
I'm okay either way, personally.
Anyone else have a strong opinion about that? Whether to include that clause, reduce VMT through a 2-pronged approach, or add in reduce VMT, especially from gas vehicles?
Yeah, I feel strongly that this is a climate action plan. It's not a congestion action plan. And so the goal here is to reduce the burning of gasoline. So the vehicle miles traveled that we care about are the vehicle miles traveled from gas vehicles. Assuming our electricity is going to be clean and our vehicles our electric vehicles are going to be a cleaner alternative. Well, no, I guess they're not 100% clean. They still do have some carbon. They have a carbon footprint. So yeah, maybe leave it how it is.
Maybe a simple suggestion would just, can we say reduce petroleum VMT? Like, I mean, can we just add in a word that, or gas VMT, gas derived VMT? I mean, we just adding that simple word like that gets to what you're trying to reduce the amount of vehicles miles traveled, but you're also really emphasizing gas vehicles.
Thank you. James?
So some cities have split out separate explicit gas VMT and electric or EV VMTs, and then they've had separate targets for each. I guess my only worry here would be, I don't know if we have a good metric for measuring gas VMT as separate from overall VMT. So then our goal might not align as well with our metrics, but whereas sort of the language of especially from gasoline vehicles holds us less to a specific metric of reducing gas VMT. But I mean, you know, I obviously support reducing gas VMT.
Yeah, I'd be okay with just saying reduce VMT from gas vehicles, just because it sounds really simple and easy to understand. And I think it does still like include people who are just biking, you know, at least half of the time or 3/4 of the time or something like that.
And the one concern on the table is whether or not that can be tracked inside of the VMT data, because we won't be able to necessarily separate. Is that right, James? That's what you were saying?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's why the gas metric would kind of, I guess that's why having 2 metrics, you're right, you'd be able to look at reduced gas.
Yeah, yeah, sorry, Deb.
No, I'm just saying that you use those to inform, and it's maybe not perfect, but I think, you know, I'm okay with whether it's gas or comma, especially from gas, comma, through it, like whatever we want to do there. But I think we're just trying to emphasize, to Janelle's point, it's a climate action plan, and we're really concerned about petroleum-based travel. So however we want to word that in where it's gentle enough that it doesn't mean we have to come up with some real complicated metrics and get crazy here. Like, I just think we can tweak it, and then because of the battery of, the battery of metrics that we're looking at, I think we can derive from a couple of these that we're actually achieving that, because we're having more EV sales, we're having, you know, less gas, and we're having less vehicles miles traveled. So I feel like we have enough different indicators there that could help showcase that.
Thank you. And I just also, sorry, I have something ringing at my house. I apologize. I also just want to acknowledge the time, because we're a little past our target end time of 6:30. It's 6:42. But I think it's obviously we all care about getting to conclusion on this, and it's a very important topic. So that does not mean it's not important. But in terms of the modifications, do you think we could get clarity before we move on to the next item on this item? Josie, it sounded like you might have a proposal.
Yeah, so I'm going to propose to keep the action, reduce vehicle miles traveled by, I think we wordsmithed it, by 25%, or a number recommended by the Complete Streets Commission. And so we're going to keep that. And then under the description, the first line is reduce VMT, and I think we can add from gas vehicles through a two-pronged approach. And then we say change the zoning and then make it easier to navigate by bicycle and pedestrian. So we've just added from gas vehicles. And I think you're right, we don't have a specific way to track that number, but I think we can sort of triangulate to get to it. And I'm okay with that.
Thank you.
And I would also propose Josie's original proposal that in number 2, we add the tracking of and have a goal about reducing gasoline sales within the city of Menlo Park by, what did we say, 10% a year from the 2018 baseline?
Yes. Yep. I have that. Okay, are we kind of in agreement about that?
I think we're in agreement about that. We did have a request from the staff to talk a little bit about number 6, and also to speak to expectations around community engagement.
Okay, so if you remember, 6 is a moratorium on building in the area that's expected to be flooded by 2100. So that would be the blue areas that I showed you on that map. And the way we have it here is until global emissions stabilize at net zero. Deb, you're muted.
Thank you, Josie.
Sorry, by moratorium, do we mean you can't build there? Are we just saying not allowed? So I feel like, and that's also Belhaven, a lot of that neighborhood. I kind of feel like that might be, is there a way to, I get what you're trying to do there, but I'm just wondering if that, again, because they're, you know, we've talked a lot about inequality, and I just wonder if this has an unintended consequence of, you know, maybe they want to build a new library or something, or replace something. I mean, how, it seems like it could be, I'm just wondering if there's a way to say something like not moratorium is a bit strong, or maybe there's mitigation without a mitigation plan, or I don't know what others are thinking, but I just wonder if that's
I think
essentially saying no building over there.
And to Deb's point, I think the question I would have, and I don't know if this is something, Rebecca, that the staff would have more information on, but what I remember from the start of the year was the community center in Belhaven. That project was a significant project that the city was undertaking, in addition to the Willow Village proposal from Facebook. And so, and my only question would be, again, I'm not trying to create an issue, but from the city's perspective, I think the Willow Village project has a significant impact on revenue to bring into the city. And in the current climate, how do we think about that? But I don't know, Rebecca, if there's any updates on any buildings or any other projects we should think about in this with this number 6 item.
Yeah, so you're correct as to the types of development that are in the near term. There's also, last night, council was looking at an EIR for Menlo Flats, which is for housing as well, by Greystar, I believe. So there's revenue, as you mentioned, and then also housing, you know, in which the Bay Area faces a large deficit in.
Thank you. Deb?
Yeah, one thing to think about, guys, too, is I don't know if this makes sense to you. I'm just kind of going off the cuff here, but that whole area has been here before climate change was even an issue, right? So we've got a lower socioeconomic area over there that, by virtue of where they are now at risk because of this situation. And I think I don't know that I'm struggling with this approach of saying no building over there, because I feel like they're already sort of screwed, and just by being there. It seems to me like we should be focusing more on language around the mitigation and what the city's going to have to invest in. You heard from that one gentleman. He said it's already going to happen. Like, we know it's happening, and I don't really have enough clarity on what's being done with seawalls or whatnot to help protect that community. But I'm just a little bit worried that it's a good intention, and I get where it's coming from, but when I put a layer over my, like, just the lens of inequality and what I know that community is suffering with, it just gives me a bit of a vibe that we're not going to invest in you over there, and we don't want any building, and you just kind of got to live with it. And I don't know if maybe I'm being harsh. Okay. I'm just speaking a little, like, this is the vibe I'm getting a little bit when I'm thinking about this. So I'm just wondering if there's a way to rethink that. And I know that we want to move forward with this, but does anybody else get that feeling, or is it just me?
Thank you, Deb. I think Tom is raising his hand to speak now.
Yep. Thank you, Deborah. I think you raised important points about it. And just thinking back to the news story we saw at the beginning of the meeting, that was looking at essentially large commercial development that's been going on in at-risk areas. And that is the type of thing that we're really looking at as a possible issue. So there's all kinds of ways to try to look at how do we get what we want, which is no more risk taking in this risky zone, unless it's for some good purpose or the risk was so small or the benefits so great. And then also, the other part of what we have to look at is no more of this risk taking until something happens. Like, and the standard set out there was a pretty tough one, until the global emissions reach net zero, which is a ways out. Oh, you know, it's going to be a long time till net zero happens. So, you know, maybe we can look at restructuring this to be focused more on some form of development that the city doesn't want to take a risk on or be hauled into a risky position. And this is the type of thing a council really needs to look at, is what is their stance going to be at building in what will become tidal lands through other action.
I'll just say one last thing and then I'll let others talk, because I'm sorry. One thing that comes to mind is the second sentence: consider requiring developers to pay an escrow account to fund deconstruction of the buildings. What if it was flipped to say, if developers want to go in here, then they need to put a fund together to help protect this community and be part of enabling this community to sort of, I like the idea of, if developers want to be over there, then let's help solve the problem and make that community thrive in what we know they're already going to be at risk for. So getting the private sector involved in the mitigation, and sort of, instead of making it sound like a penalty, like you got to destruct your buildings, maybe it's more like, how do you, I mean, other societies have been built around higher levels of waters through levees and whatnot. So can they not be part of the solution And that would then make this a little bit more, it would have a different flavor to it because it would take it from a, you guys don't get any more building over there or any more industry. We want a moratorium to, let's have the private industry be, and maybe they have incentives. Actually, this probably sounds radical, but maybe there's incentives for them to build over there if they can help with the mitigation sort of infrastructure or whatever. But something of that vibe instead of the way this is written here. Is that possible?
So we have two people who want to speak, and I just wanted to say one thing, which is, I think I want to just return us to the fact that it's a climate action plan, and the goal is to reduce greenhouse gases. And so, in the spirit of that being the goal of, or the outcome we are seeking, I think it's important to recognize what was the significance of the moratorium on the greenhouse gases, as opposed to the element we've been discussing. I agree with what we've been discussing. I just also wanted to point that out. But I think, Janelle, you were waiting to speak, and then Josie.
Yeah, thank you. Just listening to the conversation, I'm kind of feeling like this is too hard to solve on this at this meeting. I know I totally recognize that adaptation is going to be really important, and I appreciate this item. But as I've heard these other ideas and kind of the concerns around it, it just, yeah, it seems really complicated.
Are you proposing that we maybe either have another meeting or?
I might be proposing that we take it out of what goes to the city council. I kind of hate to do that because I know a lot of work went into it. But I also, yeah, I guess I'm just having hesitation. I think adaptation is critical, but this is an action that has a lot of ramifications. And you know, we haven't mentioned time frame yet either. Like, if this isn't till 2100, for a lot of people, that's, you know, like their whole life, they could live there. And so it's, the time frame really matters. You know, everything science is saying is that this is actually going to be accelerated, and it's going to be much sooner than anyone thought. But at what point does it become time to stop building in a place? That's a very hard question. If a building lasts 30 years, if we put it up today, it will be, you know, it will have not flooded by the time it's done. It's fully baked. So I don't know. The time frame also throws me.
Yeah, and I think also too, and the fact that we're now in a lens of inequality, which you guys have weaved that in, and I appreciate that, because I really think it makes us have to look at this a bit differently. And this area, this one particular item here, you can't tease that out. It's one and the same. It's both woven in, right? It's climate change adaptation and it's inequality. So we need to be really very mindful of that. And I don't think that this is addressing the inequality piece on here. So that's what I'm a bit worried about, and I think it's very relevant.
Thank you, Deb. Josie and Tom.
So I appreciate everyone's comments. It's a super complicated issue. In fact, it's probably the most complicated one that's on here. And yet it needs to become a part of the city conversation, like really soon. We cannot continue to punt this one. The city council cannot continue to punt on this because, you know, the costs are significant, both to human lives, right? I mean, yes, we can build these levees, but we're one earthquake away from those failing and that resulting in loss of life. So I think it's risky to just say, well, let's continue building, let's build the seawalls, you know, let's even get the developers to pay for the seawalls, but you still have people then living right up against potentially like a 15-foot, you know, wall of water. So I don't know the answer. I do think the community needs to be involved. Like, I have heard that Belhaven residents are upset with the amount of development that's happened already with all the new traffic that it's introduced. And so that's one voice within that community. Maybe there's another voice that says, no, we want more development. We want more building here. But I think it's important to engage the community. So I don't necessarily think that if there was less development there, that the community necessarily would be up in arms about that. But I do think engaging them is really important. And in terms of including it, adaptation for sure has become standard and including in caps. It's no longer just greenhouse gas emissions. Every cap has adaptation measures. So it would be unusual for us to exclude it from our cap based on what's sort of the standard today.
Thank you.
Josie,
And
would you
Tom.
consider putting enact a moratorium on commercial building? 'Cause I
Sorry,
think that,
Deb. Tom's been waiting to speak for like about 3 rounds of people, so I just want to
okay.
make sure Tom gets an
Okay,
opportunity.
I'll be quiet now. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, you're muted, Tom.
You're muted, Tom.
Thank you. The thing I was thinking about, and just recognizing how complex an issue it is, and how we've not been able to hold public meetings during months, and how the justice lens and equality has really been making itself much more prominent and understood, that maybe there would be a way to take a look at a 6th goal that would be to raise the whole adaptation plan development to a task that the city would take on, and because I think it may need other departments, not just a subcommittee of the EQC. So, a way to deal with it is to raise it in here, recognizing that the community has to have a pretty heartfelt conversation about the whole climate plan and its attempt to give Belhaven a chance, and then about what kinds of land use makes sense.
Thank you, Tom. And I think James and Rebecca, so I want to hear from everybody, but we also have Clay from the city on the phone with us. If we wanted to hear a little bit about, for something like this, what would a community engagement plan look like? So I didn't know, Clay, if you were still with us and if you would like to share any insights with the commission before we continue our discussion. Oh, there's Rebecca.
Hi, yes, I'm sure Clay can chime in. I know he's listening in. And sometimes participating in other meetings too, as our public engagement manager. Oh, there he is. All right, you want to take it away, Clay?
Well, I wasn't going to add too much. I wasn't prepared for anything, but I wanted to hear some of the commissioners' thoughts and just remind everyone that the council has adopted a public engagement framework that we would attempt to follow. And so I'd have to kind of look at this and listen to you guys to get some input before really analyzing how that fits into the framework that the council has adopted. But I would hope that we would use that going forward.
Thank you, Clay. James, I think you were waiting to share your comments as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think Deb raised some really good points about this potentially, like she said, looking like it's an inequitable policy, when really the goal behind it was about our community taking responsibility for putting lives and livelihoods at risk in a future scenario that's going to occur relatively soon. I'm wondering if instead of a moratorium on building in flood zones until global emissions stabilize at net zero, we focus more on it being about the protection and the responsibility for those communities, and instead it was enact a global moratorium on building in flood zones until the city has a plan for the protection of these communities or something of that sort. It's maybe a little more vague. Obviously, the form of protection we would most like to see is us and the rest of the world reducing emissions down to, halt sea level rise. But in the absence of that, just like Josie and I think Tom were both getting at, showing that the community is thinking about, that the city is thinking about this and looking at it and thinking about if something's going to be built here and the sea is going to rise, do we have plans to put up a wall? Do we have plans to, what do we have planned to protect this community?
That resonates with me because I think what I'm hearing is that we want to, as a commission, we care deeply about bringing the lens of inequality to this and understanding that actions taken today put lives at risk tomorrow. And that's important to us. And it's not that, I'm also hearing that, we have a proposal of how to address it in there right now, but we don't necessarily believe as a commission we have all the answers, because this probably exceeds our areas of expertise as the EQC, but what is in our area of expertise is inviting the city to recognize that there are actions being taken today that do put lives at risk, and that the science behind that is very strong, and it is a likely, if not certain, outcome. And so we need to be prepared for that. Yes, James.
Sure, there was just one other point that I wanted to add there that I had forgotten about. I think the other issues a lot of people could take with this, as it's worded right now, is that this puts a local restriction on us for something that is not entirely within our control. Like we've talked about our ability to influence global emissions, but you know, that puts the ability to build out of our hands, whereas saying we can't build until we take local accountability for this. And again, it'll force the city to take a more real accounting of what the costs will be to actually protect buildings put up in these zones. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you though.
That's great. And I think the other part of what you're saying and what others have said is it will also force the community, the city, to engage in those dialogues with the community, because we can hear anecdotal pieces from different members of the Belhaven community, but in effect, this is something that should be a kind of more of a public dialogue than a one-off anecdotal story situation. So I think it sounds like what I'm hearing is a lot of agreement for moving an item that doesn't put the Belhaven neighborhood in a disadvantage, but instead calls the city to action to recognize the impact of the actions the city is authorizing that most directly impact that neighborhood, without addressing the fact that climate change is going to create sea level rise, and that sea level rise will directly impact that community. And so I think we could absolutely modify the language to address that. And Rebecca Turley, I think you may have had your hand up at one point. Did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, just that I completely agree with what you and James are saying, and I think Deb brought up a really good point as well. I think it probably is a good idea just to get this on the city's radar, because I'm not sure how much they're thinking about this right now, and I do really like the idea of like just having them commit to a plan before we build. And then I was also going to bring up like maybe just this last sentence could be changed right now too. Like instead of considering developers to fund deconstruction of their buildings, they could just like fund efforts to promote resilience within that community. And like, I don't know, how exactly that would work, and if that would discourage developers from coming in because it might be more expensive, but it's just something to consider. And like the wording would be more about, building up the community if they come in to develop, rather than like tearing down current buildings.
Thank you. Josie.
So I think this is all good input. I'm writing down notes, and I want to propose we could change the action to enact a moratorium on building in the flood zone until the city has a plan for protecting residents and businesses in that zone. And then the description would be, until the city has a plan for protecting residents and businesses, enact a moratorium on building, consider requiring developers to fund efforts to protect the community. Does that kind of encapsulate everything we're talking about?
Yes, and I would wonder too if there's even sources outside of the develop. If it needs to be, could all the funds come from the developers, or would we want to encourage the city to evaluate additional alternative funding resources given the size and magnitude of the challenge? That's the only thought I would have. Josie.
I think that's not precluded from this language. So for sure, they're going to have to access other funds. It's just consider requiring developers to fund those efforts. So if you're going to develop there, then you're going to have to fund the protection too.
Gotcha. And Deb, I couldn't tell if you were raising your hand, but
No, I think
Oh,
this
okay.
is in a better direction because I want this to be more of an environmental justice issue and sort of protecting what's already there and not making it seem like we just want to protect new developments because it just doesn't. So it's going in a much better direction than what's written here. And I do think, and I haven't done the research on this, but I just wonder if there's some interesting case studies where developers are coming in with maybe an incentivized plan to actually be part of the solution. So they're using their, the capital of the private industry to help cities and communities with resilience. Maybe there is some kind of interesting, thing out there where that's being done. But it really needs to be a protection of communities and those that are, what's the word? I'm forgetting the word right now, but just
vulnerable.
Yeah, vulnerable communities. Thank you. That way, we really are weaving in some of the sort of inequality that we see, social, the environmental injustice and such into this, which factors hand in hand with the climate change adaptation for this community in particular.
And that makes sense. Thank you, Deb. And just building off of what Deb said, I do think it was highlighted in one of the videos. I believe it was the first video that talked about Facebook's engagement with the neighborhoods and at almost like I didn't get a sense, or I don't remember how broad the engagement was, but it did get the sense that they were saying any new buildings they developed were already above the sea level rise, and that they were engaging in strategies around the community that they're located in and resiliency. So I don't know if there are even local examples that we could draw on or point to or build upon or, encourage to expand or whatever that are happening already. Tom, did you want to say something? You'd had your hand up at one point.
Yes, thank you. So I'm still back to wondering if we ought to omit the action of enact a building moratorium and just go to the action of the council would want to adopt, that they would pursue a plan to develop a climate mitigation or a climate adaptation plan for these at-risk areas, and have them make the concerted effort to bring in the applicable commissions that would be able to work on that and take more time to parse the issue out. Because I do agree with Deb's observation that it can appear pretty tone deaf for us to slap a building moratorium on an area that where we haven't defined what the building is. And if it was just somebody wanting to rehab their home, that's maybe our unintended consequence. So just trying to lay it open so the city ought to design and develop the type of response to climate adaptation that they need.
We also have previously, you got thumbs up and a couple hands, I think. We also previously, when talking about housing in past meetings, have talked about the fact that there is a housing crisis. And the other thing that this building moratorium would do is, given the nature of Willow Village and the other housing project that Rebecca mentioned, it could damper the city's ability to, because so much of the available space to build unfortunately is in that district, it could hamper the city's ability to address the housing crisis. And so I don't know if that is part of the inequality lens. It's not necessarily the Belhaven community specifically, but it is acknowledging that in our community there are people who need housing and do not have it. So I think it's Josie and then Deb.
So Tom, I think it's an interesting idea to kind of make it a little more open-ended. I think my concern is that the city actually has a conflict of interest or competing interests on this, right? Because they need, those developer fees to fund their budget. And so they're very incentivized, they're very motivated to allow the development and just sort of forget or just sort of set aside like what's going to happen in the future and those people in the future, what they're going to have to deal with. So I feel like that's sort of the path they've been on so far. And it would be very easy for them if we just made this very open-ended and said, evaluate, sea level rise and how you want to do it. I think it could get punted very easily versus if we're proposing something that's more, in my view, potentially appropriate for the situation, then I think they can always, this is like, are we compromising before it goes to the city council and they have to wrestle with this issue? Like we're wrestling with it. They really should be wrestling with it, right? I mean, they really need to weigh all these different factors. And I feel like going through that process is much more likely to happen if we keep it at enacting a moratorium versus just study the options.
Deb.
Yeah, I agree with that. I don't think we should say anything like evaluate. I think that what we realize here is that regardless of building or not, there's a problem. It's going to impact businesses already. It's going to impact all that, the new hotels that are out there. The whole community will be underwater. So Houston, we have a problem now, right? So I don't like tying this into no more development. It's like, no, we have stuff we need to protect now already. So I don't think we say evaluate. I think we say develop a climate change adaptation plan, concrete plan to address the known sea level rise that this community is going to experience and start getting a plan together. Like we don't have to figure out what the plan is, but it shouldn't be don't build more over there. It should be protect what we have. So I would rather make the strong language that they need a plan to protect the communities and businesses that are already over there. And however that's done, maybe there's funding or maybe there's some private partner, maybe Facebook has, we're not going to solve that today. But I think that if instead of trying to focus on development and new development, if we just say they need a plan and tie it into sort of this environmental injustice and making that community like we care about it and we want to protect it, that's the vibe I think this should be. I don't like the moratorium sort of language at all. So can we maybe make it a really strong, like develop a concrete climate adaptation plan and that needs to be mitigated over the course of the next 10 to 20 years through a variety of means that can be evaluated. Like we don't have to figure that out, but that's a better way to frame this than to look at moratoriums on new buildings.
I 100% agree with Deb. I would add one thing, which is if we would feel comfortable giving a proposed timeline for that plan to be completed. So we could say like plan completed by end of 2021, or I'm just making this up, but I 100% agree with Deb. And I think if that's the path we take, the only thing I would add is a date by which we would expect the city's plan to be completed. This would also kick off what Clay was talking about around the four-pronged approach to public engagement. Because if the city has to make a plan, they also have to engage the city. So we would essentially be accomplishing both of the things that we were concerned about without necessarily putting the Belhaven neighborhood or other aspects of the city, regardless housing revenue, in jeopardy. Janelle, you looked like you were going to say something. No? Okay. So are we, with all of this thought about, oh, sorry, Janelle, it's my birthday too. Yeah, we have the same birthday. Thank you.
Oh my God, what are the chances we would have an EQC meeting on two commissioners?
Probably pretty low. Oh, that's funny.
This is fun, right?
It's great. It's great. So sorry, I got giggly. So given everything we've talked about and all of the modifications we've discussed, do we have closure on modifications to number 6 as well? Yes, Josie.
So what I have is develop a climate adaptation plan to address known sea level rise to protect the Belhaven community
and
by a year from now, July 2021.
That sounds good to me. Tom.
So just so the English works well, I think. So it's by 2021, develop a plan.
Oh, start with the, okay.
Yep. And then instead of known sea level rise, maybe we say forecasted, because someone can argue what is known.
Okay. By July 2021, develop a climate adaptation plan to address forecasted sea level rise to protect the Belhaven community. Sorry, develop a climate adaptation plan to protect the Belhaven community to address forecasted sea level rise. Does that sound good?
One quick thing, should we just say develop a plan, like you just said there? Can you read it back, Josie, one more time?
Mm-hmm. Develop a, by July 2021, develop a climate adaptation plan to protect the Belhaven community from forecasted sea level rise.
Do you think we should say plan and implementation strategy? Because I don't want them to have a nice plan that just sits on a shelf. Like, do you think we need to do that, or is that too granular? Tom likes that.
What was it again? To
develop a plan and implementation strategy. So we want to see some actual milestones and, you know.
Okay.
Not just a plan.
I like that too.
Okay, I'm good with that.
And any other questions about number 6? No. Okay. So are we ready with all the modifications that we've addressed, James?
I just wanted to ask a question about the potential wording of our final motion, if no one has any other modifications that they want to discuss first.
You are asking the exact question I was going to ask, so that's great.
Okay, perfect.
Does anybody want to answer James's question, or does anybody have anything else they want to mention? No? Okay, go ahead, James.
All right. So, you know, the last time we met for our last special meeting, we proposed the 90% or the zero emission by 2030, 90% reduction, 10% negative emissions. And a number of council members expressed support for it, but it wasn't explicitly codified. And so implicit in the construction of this plan and in its adoption would be the adoption of that goal. But I was just wondering if to make explicit to the members of the community who might not be as involved in this whole process, if our motion should be worded something like, should just call out specifically that we are both adopting that goal and adopting this plan. And so say something like EQC recommends that council adopt a goal of net zero emissions by 2030 through a 90% reduction and 10% negative emissions, and adopt the draft climate action plan to accomplish that goal, or something like that.
That sounds good. And then I think we just add a clause at the end to be revisited. I would say within the next year or a year from now or something like that, to be revisited by July 2021.
Yeah, I agree. Because
for the plan to be revisited, not the goal, right?
Yeah, the plan, not the goal.
Yeah.
And
to potentially incorporate
more
actions that were deferred due to budget crisis.
Yes, I agree. I think that's perfect. Does anybody have a concern if that is the wording of the motion? Do we have the motion? Does somebody want to propose that motion?
I so move.
Josie, thank you. Do we have a second?
I'll second then.
Thank you, James. And all those in favor, we have to vote
Just
for Rebecca.
let me make sure.
Sorry.
I've got the motion correct here. Okay, so the motion made by Commissioner Payne and seconded by.
Actually, it was made by me, seconded
by James.
Okay. So is to recommend the draft cap to the city council with an addition of a reduction of, so I just want to capture, because it
Yeah.
sounds like you had
James, can you
consensus.
say it again?
Sure. It's to recommend that the City Council adopt a zero emission by 2030 target through a 90% reduction in emissions and a 10% negative emission strategy or carbon removal strategy, as well as adopt the draft climate action plan in order to achieve that goal, with the addendum that this plan be revisited in a year in order to potentially to discuss the implementation of further actions that had to be deferred due to the COVID crisis.
I think it might be our longest motion ever.
Right, and so I just
But
want to
our
make sure because
best ever.
Yeah, great.
because you had consensus around VMT.
So I have 8 additional tweaks to the text, which I think as we went along, we got consensus about. So I feel good about those tweaks, and I don't think we need to put them into the motion, although I can write them up and send them to you, Rebecca, if you need that.
No, I don't think we need to do that. We just need to mention that and areas of the revised areas of the CAP that the commission came to consensus on for strategies. It sounded like 2,
2, 4, and 6.
6. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And now we can vote.
Right. So I'll do the roll call, and you can say yes, no, or
abstain.
Commissioner London?
Yes.
Commissioner Payne?
Yes.
Commissioner Cabot?
Yes.
Commissioner Price?
Yes.
Commissioner Martin?
Yes.
Commissioner Gillard?
Yes.
Commissioner Turley?
Yes.
Thank you. Motion passes unanimously.
Thank you. Yay! That's very exciting. Hold on, I have to go back to my script. Okay. So that actually brings us to the end of our agenda. So happy birthday to Janelle.
Happy birthday, Ryan.
Thank you. And thank you everybody.
Happy birthday.
Thank you for all of your dedication to getting to this point. Josie, Tom, James,
Yeah,
you've done so much to get us here. So thank you.
CAP subcommittee. Woo.
Excellent work. Mhm.
Okay, I'm gonna jet.
Yeah. Bye. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
And have a great night.
Same to you all.
Bye. Happy
Thank
birthday.
you.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.